A millionaire's new marriage to a black woman caused family uproar. Hoping to invalidate the marriage, his family ordered a DNA test, only to discover she was actually their long-lost niece, separated during a hospital fire decades ago. Their attempts to break up the marriage revealed it was already invalid for unexpected reasons. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Blackwood mansion hummed with a low thrum of unspoken tension. Sunlight, fractured by the leaded glass windows, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany floors. Arthur Blackwood, a man etched with the weariness of 70 years, sat stiffly in a plush armchair, his gaze fixed on the swirling amber liquid in his glass. Isha, his wife, radiant even in her apprehension, sat opposite him, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her teacup. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and simmering resentment, felt heavy with unspoken accusations. "It's uncomfortable, Arthur," Isha finally said, her voice soft but steady, a counterpoint to the simmering storm within the house. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge over a chasm of unspoken fears. Arthur sighed, the sound a rustle of dry leaves. "My family, they're not used to things being different." He swirled the amber liquid, avoiding her eyes. The unspoken truth hung between them, sharp and bitter. Different meant Isha, a vibrant, intelligent black woman who'd shattered the carefully constructed facade of his privileged world. He watched her, the lines of worry etched on her face a mirror to his own internal turmoil. He loved her, fiercely, desperately, but the disapproval radiating from his family, the subtle digs, the pointed silences, were slowly poisoning their newfound happiness. He'd promised her a life of love and security, but the shadow of his family loomed large, threatening to engulf them both. Isha met his gaze, her eyes, dark and luminous, reflecting the complexity of their situation. "Different isn't bad, Arthur," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "It's just unexpected." A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her shoulders, betraying the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. The unspoken question hung in the air. How much longer could they withstand this storm? The weight of their secret, their precarious position, settled heavily between them, a palpable presence in the opulent silence of the Blackwood drawing room. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of their wedding, now felt heavy with the impending threat of their unraveling. The DNA results arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace of their opulent lives. Beatrice, Arthur's viperish sister, clutched the report, her face a mask of barely controlled triumph. The hushed whispers in the Blackwood drawing room, once filled with the clinking of champagne flutes, were now choked with a suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic thump of Isha's heart. Sunlight, previously warm and inviting, now seemed cold and accusatory, highlighting the stark lines of betrayal etched on Isha's face. It's impossible," Arthur breathed, his voice barely audible above the pounding in his ears. The paper felt like burning coal in his trembling hands. Isha, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hurt, watched him, her own silent scream trapped in her throat. The scent of lilies, a constant reminder of their wedding day, now felt suffocating, cloying with the bitter taste of deceit. Beatrice, savoring her moment of power, smirked. "Impossible? Nothing is impossible, Arthur. Your precious Isha. She's your niece." The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous, each syllable a tiny dagger piercing Isha's heart. Tears welled in Isha's eyes, blurring the already distorted image of the family gathered around her. Faces contorted with a mixture of shock, guilt, and a chilling relief. The luxurious setting, the opulent furniture, suddenly felt alien, cold, and hostile. The weight of their secret, once a shared burden, now felt like a crushing weight on her chest, alone. Arthur rose, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor, a sound that mirrored the fracturing of his carefully constructed world. He moved towards Isha, his gaze softening as he saw the raw hurt reflected in her eyes. He reached out, his hand covering hers, a silent promise of support amidst the storm. The touch, a simple gesture, was the first crack in the wall of resentment that separated him from his family. His family, the source of his wealth and privilege, now felt like an enemy camp, ready to pounce and tear his life apart. A sudden wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been so naive? This isn't right, he stammered, his voice cracking. The words, intended to calm Isha, also echoed his own confusion and guilt. The family's hushed whispers intensified, swirling around them like a predatory pack, threatening to tear them apart. The opulent room, once a sanctuary, felt more like a gilded cage. The weight of his family's deceit bore down, suffocating the fledgling love he shared with Isha. The future, once bright with promise, now seemed dark and uncertain. The opulent Blackwood drawing room, usually shimmering with the warmth of a crackling fire, felt frigid. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now hung heavy and cloying, a bitter perfume of betrayal. Isha's eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were clouded with a hurt so profound it seemed to physically shrink her. Arthur, his face etched with a mixture of shock and guilt, reached for her hand, his touch tentative, afraid to break the fragile dam of her composure. This isn't real, he whispered, his voice raw with disbelief. He squeezed her hand, a silent plea for reassurance, a promise of protection against the storm brewing around them. Beatrice, her face a mask of cold satisfaction, watched them with predatory eyes. The diamond earrings that glittered on her earlobes seemed to mock Isha's quiet despair. Real? Arthur, the DNA test is undeniable. She's your blood. Your niece. The words hung in the air, each syllable a blow, each syllable a shattering of Isha's carefully constructed world. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, crushing the joy of her recent marriage, the happiness of finding love with a man who had seemingly seen past the superficial barriers of their lives. She felt a chilling loneliness, a deep sense of displacement. She looked around the room, at the faces of her new relatives, their expressions a chilling mixture of surprise, guilt, and a selfish relief. But how? Isha's voice was barely a breath, a fragile whisper lost in the silence of the room. The opulent furniture, the priceless paintings, suddenly felt alien, cold, hostile. They were symbols of a life she had stepped into, only to discover it was built on a foundation of lies. The gilded cage had become a prison. Arthur's gaze shifted from Isha to his family, his eyes hardening. The love he felt for Isha warred with the ingrained loyalty to his family, a battleground where his heart bled and his mind fractured. He saw the whispers, the sideways glances, the subtle shifts in their body language, the calculations made in their eyes. He had been blind, naive, blinded by his love for Isha and deafened by his family's subtle racism and classism. He'd failed to see the manipulation, the subtle cruelty that had been festering beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. A single tear traced a path down Isha's cheek. It was a tear of betrayal, of confusion, of a love cruelly shattered before it could even blossom fully. The weight of her family's secret, once a shared burden between her and Arthur, now pressed down on her alone. A suffocating silence descended, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock, each tick a hammer blow to Arthur's already fractured conscience. He knew then, with a certainty that cut through the shock and disbelief, that this was only the beginning. The fight for their love had just begun. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the scent of lilies. Isha retreated further into herself, the vibrant energy that had so captivated Arthur now dimmed, replaced by a fragile vulnerability. He watched, helpless, as the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin pale and translucent beneath the soft glow of the chandelier. The opulent Blackwood drawing room, usually a haven of warmth, felt like an icebox, each polished surface reflecting Isha's growing despair. How could this be?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of an antique grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow to her heart. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now held a deep, unsettling sadness, mirroring the vast chasm that had suddenly opened between her and the life she had imagined. Arthur reached for her hand again, his touch hesitant, afraid of shattering the fragile shell of her composure. He felt the tremor in her fingers, a silent testament to the turmoil raging within her. The hand that had once felt so warm and alive was now icy cold, a chilling reflection of her emotional state. Beatrice, however, remained unmoved, her expression unchanging, a cold, calculating mask of satisfaction. She watched the unfolding drama with predatory glee, her diamond earrings catching the light, their brilliance a stark contrast to the shadow of despair that had fallen over Isha. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken accusations and simmering resentments. It was a silence punctuated only by the relentless ticking of the clock, each tick a reminder of the precious moments slipping away, moments that could never be reclaimed. "It's the truth, Isha." Beatrice's voice cut through the silence, sharp and precise like a surgeon's scalpel. A truth that should have been revealed long ago. Her words were laced with a cruel satisfaction, a bitter victory that tasted as sweet as poison. She saw the shattering of Isha's dreams as an affirmation of her own deeply ingrained prejudices. Arthur's gaze darted between Isha and his sister, his heart a battlefield where love and loyalty clashed. He felt the pull of his family's expectations, the weight of tradition, the suffocating pressure of years of ingrained biases. But in Isha's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own guilt, a mirror to his own failings. He'd been blinded by his love, deafened by his family's whispers. He'd failed to see the truth hidden beneath the polished surfaces of their lives. He knew then, with a profound sense of loss, that the fight for their love had just begun. The battle was not just against his family, but against the prejudice that had festered within him, too. His heart ached for Isha, and the fight for her was far from over. The air in the Blackwood Manor, usually redolent with the scent of expensive polish and blooming orchids, now carried the bitter tang of betrayal. Isha stared at the DNA results, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. The ornate, antique furniture seemed to mock her with its silent, opulent indifference. Arthur, his face etched with guilt and a dawning horror, reached for her hand. Its icy coldness shocked him. "Isha," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. I'm so sorry." Beatrice, however, showed no remorse. Her perfectly sculpted lips curved into a cruel smile, the glint of diamonds in her ears mirroring the hard glint in her eyes. "I told you," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous satisfaction, "that she wasn't right for you." The casual cruelty of her words sliced through the heavy silence, further wounding Isha. Isha's gaze, once full of life, now held a chilling emptiness. The vibrant energy that had charmed Arthur was gone, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing sadness. She pulled her hand away from his, the movement sharp and decisive, emphasizing the chasm that now separated them. "How could you?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. The question hung in the air, directed at Arthur, but aimed at the entire Blackwood family, their wealth and privilege suddenly feeling suffocating and suffocatingly false. The crystal chandelier above cast long, distorted shadows, mirroring the fractured state of their lives. Arthur felt the sting of her accusation, the weight of his family's actions pressing down on him. He'd always known they disapproved, but the blatant racism and classism that fueled their actions had been masked by polite smiles and thinly veiled condescension. Now, stripped bare, their true faces were terrifying. He looked at his sister, the woman who had orchestrated this entire charade, and a cold dread washed over him. He'd been blind, foolish, and now the consequences threatened to destroy everything. The opulent drawing room, once a symbol of his success and status, now felt like a gilded cage. The ticking grandfather clock seemed to relentlessly measure the erosion of their love, each second a hammer blow against his heart. The fight for his marriage, for Isha, was far from over. It was only just beginning. And this time, he knew, it wouldn't be against his family alone, but against himself and the prejudices he'd unknowingly harbored. The heavy oak door to the study closed with a muffled thud, leaving Arthur alone with the crushing weight of his family's betrayal. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the strands coarse and brittle under his touch. The DNA results lay on his mahogany desk, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood, a symbol of his shattered world. Isha's words echoed in his ears, sharp and cold. "How could you?" The question wasn't just for him. It was a condemnation of his family, their ingrained prejudices laid bare. He'd been blinded by their wealth and social standing, failing to see the ugliness beneath the polished veneer. He picked up a framed photograph from his desk, a picture of him as a boy, his father's arms slung around his shoulders, a mischievous grin on his face. A memory surfaced. A hospital fire, chaos and screams, a frantic search for a missing baby girl. He'd been too young to understand, the details hazy, yet the fear lingered. Now, the fragmented memory resonated with chilling clarity. A wave of nausea washed over him. The realization hit him with brutal force. His family's callous actions weren't just about class or race. It was about a legacy of secrets, a carefully constructed lie. They tried to destroy Isha, not knowing she was family. He walked to the window, the city lights a blurry tapestry below. He thought of Isha, her quiet strength masking a deep wound. He imagined the pain of discovering she was not only rejected by him, but his family had actively sought to invalidate her existence and her marriage. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless, burning ache. He had to fix this, not just for Isha, but for himself, to reclaim his integrity from the ashes of his family's deceit. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed a number. It was a risky move, a step into the unknown. But he had to act. The future of his marriage and perhaps his soul depended on it. He needed to start his own investigation, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The fight had only just begun. The phone call was brief, clipped. A curt acknowledgement from a seasoned private investigator, a promise of discretion. Arthur hung up, the receiver clattering against the polished wood of his desk. The city lights outside, previously a blur of indifference, now seemed to pulse with a frantic energy, mirroring the turmoil within him. He could almost taste the bitter metallic tang of fear coating his tongue. He paced the study, the worn Persian rug a silent witness to his agitation. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and leather, felt heavy, suffocating. He glanced at Isha's half-finished cup of tea, a delicate floral pattern now smudged with a lipstick stain, a small, poignant reminder of her presence, her vulnerability. The silence in the grand house pressed in on him, amplifying the weight of his decision. A knock on the door, hesitant and soft. Isha entered, her eyes shadowed, her usual vibrancy dimmed. She carried a small, worn book, its cover faded and cracked. "Arthur," she began, her voice low, "I found this in the attic, an old family photo album." She offered it to him, her hand trembling slightly. He took the album, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt through him, a painful reminder of their precarious situation. He opened the album, the brittle pages crackling under his touch. Images of a younger Arthur, of his parents, of a smiling, rosy-cheeked baby girl flickered before him. The girl's face was blurred, but the resemblance, undeniable. His breath hitched in his throat. It's her," he whispered, his voice barely audible, pointing to a faded photograph of a baby girl being held by a woman, her face partly obscured by smoke. The hospital fire. Isha's gaze fell upon the picture, her eyes widening with a mixture of recognition and pain. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken emotions, the unspoken words of a shared trauma finally surfacing. The weight of decades of separation, the years of searching, the bitter taste of betrayal, all coalesced into a shared, silent understanding. The investigation had begun, but a far deeper, more profound journey into the heart of family secrets had just started. The worn photo album lay open between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of years. The scent of aged paper and faded ink filled the air, mingling with the lingering aroma of Isha's tea. Arthur traced the blurred outline of the baby girl in the photograph, a lump forming in his throat. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the stark contrast between the opulent furnishings and the raw emotion etched on Isha's face. "She's so much like you," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. The resemblance wasn't just a fleeting similarity. It was a profound echo across time. Isha nodded, her gaze fixed on the image, a storm brewing in her usually bright eyes. I always felt a connection," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. The silence stretched, filled only with the rhythmic tick-tock, each second amplifying the weight of their shared discovery. Arthur reached across the album, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was electric, a silent affirmation of their unspoken bond. "We need to find out more," he said, his voice gaining strength, fueled by a newfound determination. "We need to know who your parents were." Isha squeezed his hand, her own trembling slightly. The fear, the uncertainty, the years of unanswered questions, all seemed to coalesce in that single moment. Yet, interwoven with the fear was a fragile hope, a glimmer of light piercing through the darkness of her past. The old book fell closed, the weight of its secrets momentarily forgotten. They sat in silence, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, the only sound aside from their ragged breaths. The city lights outside danced in the windows, but within their small world, a different kind of light began to ignite. The light of a shared journey, a shared history, and a newfound hope. The DNA test had shattered one world, but in its wake, it was revealing something far more profound, a kinship that transcended blood ties, a connection forged in the fires of the past and strengthened by the shared vulnerability of the present. The investigation was far from over. It was only just beginning. The news hit Isha like a physical blow. The opulent Blackwood mansion, once a symbol of her unlikely fairy tale, now felt like a gilded cage. Arthur's face, usually etched with a kind weariness, was contorted with a grief that mirrored her own. The mahogany table between them seemed to hum with unspoken accusations. The scent of lilies, usually so comforting, now felt suffocating. "My niece," Arthur whispered, the words catching in his throat. His hand, usually so steady, trembled as he reached for a glass of water, his knuckles white against the crystal. Isha stared at him, her eyes wide and unseeing. Betrayal clawed at her, a bitter taste coating her tongue. The carefully constructed facade of her marriage, built on a foundation of love and shared dreams, crumbled into dust. The warmth of the fire in the hearth offered no solace, only a cruel reminder of the cold reality unfolding around her. How could this be?" she finally managed, her voice barely a breath, raspy with unshed tears. The silken fabric of her dress felt like a straitjacket against her skin. Arthur avoided her gaze, his shame palpable. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the action a familiar gesture of distress. "Beatrice," she orchestrated the test. He confessed, his voice heavy with guilt. "She never accepted you, never believed." Isha's breath hitched. Beatrice's cold, calculating smile flashed before her eyes, a vivid memory of subtle digs and veiled insults. The opulent surroundings suddenly seemed to mock her, accentuating the chasm of deception. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, suffocating her. She felt adrift, a leaf caught in a relentless storm. "And you?" she asked, her voice laced with a painful mixture of hope and dread. The question hung heavy in the air, the unspoken answer a cold dread settling in her heart. Arthur's gaze finally met hers, his eyes swimming with a mix of remorse and desperate love. I didn't believe her," he said, his voice breaking. "But now—" He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging between them like a shroud. The opulent room, once a symbol of their happiness, now felt like a suffocating tomb. The weight of their shared secret, their shattered reality, threatened to crush them both. The ticking grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock their despair, each tick a hammer blow to their fragile hope. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the air in the Blackwood mansion. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the turmoil within. Isha stared at the dying embers in the fireplace, the flickering light painting shadows on her face, highlighting the stark lines of exhaustion. Arthur sat opposite, his silver hair catching the firelight, a stark contrast to the shadows etched beneath his eyes. The expensive Persian rug beneath their feet felt cold and unforgiving. I need time," Isha whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The words hung in the air, fragile and laden with unspoken pain. She picked at a loose thread on her dress, the gesture a nervous tick betraying her inner turmoil. Arthur nodded, his gaze heavy with guilt. He reached across the chasm of silence that separated them, his hand hovering over hers before retracting. The gesture spoke volumes, a silent apology, a desperate plea for understanding. He knew words were insufficient. The weight of his family's betrayal, his own complicity in their actions, pressed down on him like a physical burden. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. I'll start my own investigation," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. "Find out everything. About the fire, about your adoption." He looked up, meeting her gaze. A flicker of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, ignited in his eyes. The desperation in his expression mirrored her own yearning for answers. Isha nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the dying embers. The revelation of her true identity had shattered the carefully constructed reality of her marriage. But amidst the wreckage, a new foundation was being laid, forged in shared grief and a desperate need for truth. The silence between them, though still heavy with sorrow, no longer felt like condemnation. It felt like a shared burden, a space for healing, a beginning. The cold reality of the situation remained, but within it, a flicker of hope, tenacious and resilient, began to glow. The news hit Isha like a physical blow, a tidal wave of shock and betrayal crashing over her. The ornate Blackwood drawing room, usually a symbol of wealth and privilege, felt suffocating, the gilded frames of portraits seeming to mock her. Arthur's hushed confession, "Isha, you're my niece," echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off the polished mahogany and crystal. The scent of lilies, usually so comforting, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the bitter taste in her mouth. Tears welled, blurring the already distorted image of Arthur's anguished face. He looked as devastated as she felt. The weight of his family's deception pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. How could they?" she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. The question hung in the air, unspoken yet intensely felt. The silence that followed was a deafening roar of betrayal. Arthur's hand reached out, hesitant, then retreated. The gesture spoke volumes, a stark portrayal of his inner turmoil. He was caught between his love for her and the suffocating legacy of his family's prejudices. The rich, Persian carpet beneath her feet felt cold and unforgiving, reflecting the chill that had settled deep within her heart. They didn't know," Arthur stammered, his voice tight with guilt. The words offered little comfort. The knowledge didn't lessen the sting of their manipulative actions, their calculated attempts to destroy her marriage. The firelight danced on the polished surfaces, casting long, dramatic shadows that mirrored the darkness swirling within her. Isha felt a wrenching sadness, a profound sense of displacement. The life she had known, the love she had believed in, had been built on a foundation of lies. The family that had welcomed her, albeit grudgingly, was now revealed to be the source of her deepest hurt. She was adrift, lost in a sea of deception, grasping for a lifeline, a shred of truth in the midst of the storm. The glittering chandelier above felt like a cruel mockery of her shattered dreams. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Isha stared at the ornate rug, its intricate pattern a dizzying swirl mirroring the chaos in her mind. The scent of lilies, heavy and sweet, now felt sickeningly cloying. Arthur's confession hung between them, a tangible weight in the opulent room. I didn't know," Arthur repeated, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing guilt. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. Isha flinched, pulling away. The physical distance mirrored the chasm that had opened between them. "How could you not know?" she asked, her voice trembling, each word a carefully measured accusation. The question wasn't just for Arthur. It was a lament, a cry of despair echoing the betrayal she felt. He flinched, the guilt etched deeper onto his face. "Beatrice, she orchestrated the test. She's always been jealous." His voice cracked, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. The mention of Beatrice sparked a new wave of anger within Isha. "Jealousy isn't a justification for this, for tearing my life apart, for shattering everything we built." The words felt raw, visceral, ripping through the carefully constructed facade of their happiness. Tears streamed down her face, hot and stinging. Arthur rose, pacing restlessly. The polished floorboards gleamed under the firelight, reflecting the turmoil in his eyes. I'll make it right," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. The words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The weight of his family's actions pressed heavily upon him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. He knew a simple apology wouldn't suffice. He had to do more, much more. The future, once bright and promising, now seemed shrouded in an uncertain fog. He looked at Isha, her face a mask of hurt and confusion, and knew he had to fight for her, for their love, against the legacy of his family's bigotry and deceit. The fight would be long and arduous, but he would fight for her. The heavy oak door to Arthur's study creaked shut, silencing the faint murmur of the family gathering downstairs. Isha sat on the plush velvet chaise lounge, the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco clinging to the air, a stark contrast to the lilies that had so recently filled the room. She traced the intricate pattern of the rug, the silk cool beneath her fingertips, offering little comfort. Arthur paced, his shadow a restless phantom against the amber glow of the fire. The silence hummed, thick with unspoken accusations. They tried to buy me off," Isha finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The words hung in the air, heavy with betrayal. Arthur stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. He ran a hand through his already disheveled silver hair, the gesture betraying his turmoil. "Beatrice, she's relentless." His voice was hoarse, laced with self-reproach. "Relentless in her cruelty," Isha corrected, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "She offered me a sum of money enough to disappear, to forget." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, tinged with disbelief. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the quiver of her chin. Arthur saw the hurt, the simmering rage barely contained beneath her composed exterior. He wanted to reach for her, to offer solace, but the chasm between them felt insurmountable. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. I'm so sorry, Isha. I truly didn't know the extent of their machinations." "Knowing wouldn't have changed anything," she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "Would it, Arthur? Your silence, your inaction. It's almost as bad as their active participation." He winced, the truth of her words piercing him like shards of glass. He understood her anger, her pain. He deserved it. He'd allowed his family's prejudice to blind him, to silence him. Now he had to fight for her, to prove his love was stronger than their ingrained bigotry, stronger than the insidious whispers of family loyalty. The fight had just begun. The weight of his family's actions, and his own complicity, felt crushing. But he had a promise to keep, a love to protect. The battle for his marriage, for his future with Isha, was far from over. The next morning dawned gray and sullen, mirroring the atmosphere in the Blackwood mansion. Isha, despite a sleepless night, moved with a quiet dignity that belied her inner turmoil. The aroma of strong coffee, usually a comfort, did little to soothe her. She sat at the antique breakfast table, the polished mahogany reflecting her strained face back at her. Arthur entered, his normally crisp appearance rumpled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and guilt. He looked like a man wrestling with his conscience, a battle etched onto his weary face. "Isha," he began, his voice a low rumble. I need to explain." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the clinking of china and the distant murmur of the servants. "Explain what, Arthur? That your family's attempt to buy me off was a mere misunderstanding." Her voice was low, controlled, but the bitterness was palpable. He winced, the gesture painful to watch. "No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was inexcusable, and I allowed it. I failed you." He pushed his untouched plate away, the gesture mirroring his rejection of his family's actions. "You failed to protect your wife from your own family's cruelty," she corrected, her voice edged with a quiet fury. The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow. He saw the flicker of doubt in her expression, a doubt that mirrored his own uncertainty about their future. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. The gesture was hesitant, filled with a desperate need for forgiveness. "I know, and I'm trying to make amends. I'm starting my own investigation. I will uncover the truth, no matter the cost." Isha's gaze softened slightly, the ice thawing ever so gradually. "The truth won't bring back the trust that's been shattered," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of hurt and hope. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a single rose on the table. It was a fragile bloom, a symbol of the delicate nature of their relationship, hanging in the balance. The weight of their shared history, their uncertain future, and the insidious presence of Arthur's family hung heavy in the air. But amidst the storm, a fragile spark of hope remained, a testament to their strength and the depth of their love. The fight for their marriage was far from over, but this time they would face it together. The opulent Blackwood Library, usually a sanctuary of hushed whispers and leather-bound books, felt suffocating. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass windows, cast long, accusing shadows across the room. Arthur paced, the polished floorboards gleaming under his restless feet. The scent of old paper and leather, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. Isha sat rigidly in a velvet armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken accusations. "I spoke to my solicitor," Arthur finally said, his voice rough with fatigue. "There are complications about the prenuptial agreement. Apparently, a clause regarding familial relations." He trailed off, unable to articulate the devastating implications. Isha's eyes, usually sparkling with life, were dull with pain. "Complications? What kind of complications? Is this another attempt to invalidate our marriage?" Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the carefully constructed composure she maintained. Arthur sank into a chair opposite her, the weight of his family's treachery pressing down on him. "No, Isha, this is different. It's about the fact that we're related, more closely than we ever knew. The marriage might be legally void." The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second echoing the slow disintegration of their world. Isha's breath hitched. The carefully constructed dam of her composure finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She looked at Arthur, a mixture of disbelief and betrayal etched across her face. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom earlier that morning withered under the weight of this new revelation. The sunlight, once a symbol of hope, now felt cold and harsh, illuminating the profound unfairness of their situation. The rose Arthur had placed on the table earlier remained untouched, symbolizing the fragility of their love and the looming storm on the horizon. This was not merely a battle with his family. It was a fight for their very existence as a couple. The weight of the legal technicalities, of familial betrayals, and of their shared, unexpected heritage pressed upon them like a physical burden. They were trapped, caught in a web of their own tangled past. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Isha's trembling hands. The remnants of Arthur's carefully chosen breakfast, a delicate pastry, untouched, sat beside a wilting rose, a cruel mockery of their shattered hopes. Beatrice, her face a mask of carefully controlled fury, watched them from across the room, a predatory gleam in her eyes. The air, thick with unspoken accusations and the scent of expensive perfume, felt suffocating. "So," Beatrice purred, her voice laced with a venomous sweetness, "the DNA test revealed a family connection. How inconvenient." She sipped her tea, the delicate clinking sound a jarring counterpoint to the turmoil raging within Isha. Arthur flinched. "It's not just inconvenient, Beatrice. It invalidates everything." He looked at Isha, his gaze filled with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a deep, soul-crushing sorrow. Isha's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "So all this, the lies, the tests, the attempts to break us up, it was all for nothing? Because of a technicality?" A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The carefully constructed facade of composure she'd maintained since the revelation crumbled. Beatrice chuckled, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Not entirely for nothing. It certainly brought some uncomfortable truths to light, didn't it, Arthur? About your misplaced affections." She leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "But don't despair. There are still ways to adjust the situation. Family matters can be quite flexible." Her words were dripping with thinly veiled threats. Arthur stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You will not touch her." He placed a comforting hand on Isha's, his touch radiating warmth in the icy atmosphere. Isha looked up at him, her eyes searching his. In the midst of this storm of betrayal and manipulative machinations, a new kind of connection sparked between them. A shared understanding, born of shared vulnerability, and a fierce determination to fight for their love. It was a fragile hope, flickering in the face of adversity, but it burned fiercely nonetheless. The fight, they both realized, was far from over. The legal battle loomed, but so did the battle for their hearts, and the fight to redefine the bonds of family. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows across the faded wallpaper of the hospital's archives. Dust motes danced in the weak illumination, mirroring the turmoil in Isha's heart. Arthur, his face etched with worry, held a brittle, yellowed file. The scent of aged paper and disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the past. "Adoption papers," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He ran a finger along the faded ink, tracing the name, Isabella Blackwood. A gasp escaped Isha. It was her birth name, a name she'd never known. The file detailed her adoption, a rushed process following the devastating fire. A single, blurry photograph showed a young woman, her face partially obscured by smoke, cradling a newborn. The caption read, "Unidentified mother, patient room 312. The details were scarce, fragmented pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Isha's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. The image triggered a flood of memories, the searing heat, the screams, the chaotic disorientation. A wave of nausea washed over her. "My mother," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "I never knew." Arthur pulled her close, his embrace offering a haven from the storm raging within her. He felt her trembling body, the fragile rhythm of her heart against his own. The weight of the past pressed heavily upon them, the secrets, the lies, the pain. "We'll find out," he murmured, his voice a promise, a shield against despair. "We'll find out who she was." He understood now. His family's actions weren't just about racism and class. It was about covering up a truth that ran far deeper than they could have ever imagined. The truth of their family's history and Isha's place within it. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. He looked at the photograph again, noticing something he'd missed before. A faint, almost invisible inscription on the back. A partial address, barely legible in the faded ink, but enough to start a new trail. A sliver of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, sparked in the darkness of the archive. The hunt for her parents, for her past, had just begun, and it would unite them as they ventured into the unknown together. The archive's musty air hung heavy, clinging to Isha like a second skin. Arthur's hand, warm and reassuring, rested on her back. The faint scent of lavender from his cologne, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of aged paper, offered a small comfort. She traced the faded inscription on the back of the photograph with a trembling finger, the rough texture a strange comfort against her skin. The partial address, a cryptic clue to her past, felt like a lifeline in the vast ocean of her unknown history. 312 Willow Creek Lane, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of an ancient grandfather clock in the corner. The address was tantalizingly familiar, yet utterly foreign. Arthur squeezed her shoulder gently. "We'll find it," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his own heart. He felt the weight of her sorrow, the gaping hole in her life, mirrored in the hollow ache in his own soul. He'd spent his life surrounded by wealth and privilege, oblivious to the suffering of others. This discovery had ripped the veil from his eyes, revealing a darkness in his family's past he could no longer ignore. Willow Creek Lane. It sounds familiar, Isha murmured, her gaze distant, lost in the labyrinth of forgotten memories. A flicker of recognition, like a spark in the deep night, ignited in her eyes. A fragmented image surfaced: a leafy lane, bathed in sunlight, a feeling of warmth and security, then a sudden, jarring darkness. "We'll go there tomorrow," Arthur declared, a surge of determination hardening his voice. He knew this was only the beginning, a tiny step in a long journey to uncover the truth. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a shared mission with Isha that transcended the chaos of their invalid marriage and the turmoil within his family. The fear and uncertainty still lingered, but they were now intertwined with a powerful new emotion: hope. The hope of piecing together a shattered past and forging a future together, built on truth and understanding, not lies and deceit. The old, brittle file felt less like a damning piece of evidence and more like a roadmap, guiding them towards a shared destiny. The weight of their shared burden, however heavy, felt strangely less lonely now, bound together by a nascent kinship, deeper than blood. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows across the dusty attic room, illuminating the swirling motes of dust dancing in the air. Isha shivered, not entirely from the chill. The unearthed secrets felt heavy, pressing down on her like the weight of the ancient wooden chest they'd been rummaging through. Arthur, ever the gentleman, draped his coat around her shoulders, the wool soft against her skin. "This is overwhelming," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The faded photograph, a fragile testament to a life she barely knew, felt like a cruel joke, a beautiful, cruel joke. Arthur's hand found hers, his touch firm yet gentle. "I know, my love," he murmured, his voice husky with empathy. He understood the turmoil tearing through her, mirroring the storm raging within himself. The revelation of her true lineage had shattered the carefully constructed walls of his family's world, revealing a foundation of prejudice and lies. He traced the lines of her face, the delicate curve of her cheek, the soft tremble of her lower lip. "We'll find your parents," he promised, his gaze unwavering. "We'll uncover every piece of this puzzle, together." Isha looked at him, her eyes brimming with a complex mixture of fear and hope. The years of longing for a family she'd never known, the gnawing uncertainty, now collided with the unexpected reality of finding them, and the terrifying prospect of what that discovery might entail. "What if they don't want me?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Arthur pulled her closer, his embrace a haven in the chaos. "They will," he said, his voice firm. "They'll want you more than anything in the world." And if they don't? He paused, searching for the right words. Then we'll create our own family. A family built on love, not blood. He kissed her forehead, his touch tender, conveying a depth of understanding beyond words. The attic, with its dusty relics and whispered secrets, transformed into a sanctuary, a silent witness to a love blooming amidst the ruins of a shattered past. The fragmented address, scrawled on the back of the photo, felt less like a clue and more like a promise. A promise of answers, of healing, and of a future they would face, hand in hand, together. The air hung thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Sunlight, fractured by the attic window, illuminated swirling motes in the stillness. Isha traced the faded ink of a partial address on the back of the photograph, a fragment of a life lost to flames. The image itself, a blurry snapshot of a young woman and a man, both smiling, held a strange familiarity, a painful echo of something she couldn't quite grasp. "This is my mother?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Arthur knelt beside her, his hand gently covering hers. He felt the tremor in her fingers, the silent plea for reassurance in her touch. The weight of his family's deception pressed heavily on his conscience, amplifying the sorrow etched on Isha's face. "We'll find out," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of comfort. "We'll find everything. Together." The attic, once a repository of forgotten memories, now felt like a crucible of revelations, forging a new connection between them. He saw in her eyes not just fear, but a desperate longing, a yearning for belonging, for roots in a past stolen from her. His heart ached for her, for the life she'd been denied, and the injustices she'd suffered at the hands of his own family. What if they don't want me?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. The words were a choked whisper, a confession of deep-seated insecurities fueled by decades of separation and uncertainty. He pulled her close, his embrace a shield against the chilling weight of the unknown. The warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against hers, offered a tangible solace in the face of the overwhelming uncertainty. "They will," he whispered, his voice firm, resolute. "And if they don't, well, then we'll build our own family. A family built on love, stronger than any blood tie." He kissed her hair, the scent of her perfume a familiar comfort amidst the chaos of unearthed secrets and shattered illusions. The incomplete address felt less like a puzzle piece and more like a beacon, guiding them towards a future they would build, together regardless of the past. The chipped paint of Arthur's grandfather's study clung to the musty air, a scent of aged leather and decaying paper. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows. Arthur, usually impeccably dressed, was rumpled, his tie loosened, his usually polished shoes scuffed. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He'd spent the last 3 days immersed in Blackwood family history, poring over dusty ledgers, yellowed photographs, and brittle letters. Each document felt like a betrayal, each revelation a fresh wound. He found the hospital records first, a stark contrast to the ornate, gilded frames adorning his family's portraits. The fire report, meticulously detailed, spoke of chaos, screams, and the frantic search for missing infants. A cold dread gripped him. Isha's adoption papers were tucked within a file marked confidential, their official seal mocking his family's clandestine actions. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. His family hadn't just disapproved of Isha, they had actively erased her past. A choked sob escaped him. He imagined Isha, a tiny infant, lost and alone in the chaos of that dreadful night. The thought fueled his resolve, transforming guilt into a burning desire for justice. He had to tell her. He had to share the truth no matter the cost. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling. He needed to see her face, to feel the warmth of her presence before sharing the weight of his discovery. "Isha?" he whispered into the phone, his voice rough with unshed tears. I need to see you. Tonight. It's important." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths, a stark contrast to his usual confident demeanor. He hung up, the silence of the study suddenly overwhelming. The weight of his family's secrets pressed down on him, a crushing burden that only sharing with Isha could alleviate. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed, each toll a mournful reminder of time lost, of lives irrevocably altered. The fight for his marriage for Isha had just begun. The chipped paint of the grandfather's study seemed to mock Arthur's distress. He reread the adoption papers, the crisp legal language a stark contrast to the chaotic scrawl of the hospital fire report. Isha, a tiny infant amidst the smoke and screams. The image burned itself onto his conscience. He felt a nauseous lurch of guilt. His family hadn't just rejected Isha. They'd actively conspired to erase her. He slammed the file shut, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. The scent of old paper and dust suddenly felt oppressive, a physical manifestation of his family's suffocating secrets. He needed air, needed to move, to process the weight of this revelation. He drove to their secluded cottage by the sea, the familiar coastal road a blur through his tear-blurred vision. The cottage, usually a sanctuary, felt alien tonight. Isha was curled on the sofa, a book abandoned in her lap, the firelight casting dancing shadows on her face. He watched her for a moment, the woman he loved, a woman he'd almost lost to his family's callous indifference. He sat beside her, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. Her fingers, usually so quick and lively, were still. "Isha," he began, his voice hoarse, the words caught in his throat, the enormity of what he had to tell her suffocating him. She looked up, her eyes, usually so bright, filled with a quiet sadness. "Arthur." Her voice was soft, hesitant. He took a deep breath. I found something." He pulled out the file, his hands trembling. "About your adoption. About the fire." He laid the documents gently in her lap, the weight of his family's deceit settling heavily between them. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that mirrored the turmoil in their hearts. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore, a relentless reminder of the relentless tide of emotions threatening to engulf them. Isha's hand trembled as she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the text. The quiet strength he admired so much was replaced by a vulnerable fragility that tore at him. He knew, even before she spoke, that their life together was about to change irrevocably. Isha's fingers traced the faded ink, her breath catching in her throat. The salty air, usually a comfort, now felt sharp and cold against her skin. The cottage, once their haven, felt suffocating. The rhythmic crash of the waves a relentless counterpoint to the silence between them. She looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, reflecting the flickering firelight. They knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the sea. Arthur reached for her hand, his touch tentative, hesitant. He felt the tremor in her fingers, a mirroring of the quake in his own soul. "Yes, Isha," he said, his voice rough with remorse. "They knew all along. Beatrice. She orchestrated this whole thing." The revelation hung heavy between them, the weight of decades of deceit pressing down. The scent of wood smoke from the fireplace mingled with the sharp tang of salt, a strange and unsettling combination that mirrored the turmoil in their hearts. Isha pulled away, not in anger, but in a profound sense of displacement, of being adrift. "And I believed them," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I believed their lies about my parentage, about everything." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, seeking answers he couldn't yet provide. "How could I have been so blind?" Arthur couldn't answer. He could only offer the silent comfort of his presence, the warmth of his hand gently covering hers again. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the room seem to breathe with their shared sorrow. He saw the fragile strength behind her tears, the quiet resilience that had always captivated him. This was a different kind of vulnerability, raw and exposed, and it broke his heart. He pulled her close, holding her tightly as she wept, the sobs racking her small frame. The salty tang of her tears mingled with his own unspoken grief, the shared pain binding them closer than ever. In the comforting silence that followed, they began to navigate the wreckage of their shattered assumptions, the first tentative steps toward a future they were yet to define, a future born from the ashes of deceit and the fragile embers of their enduring love. The sea continued its relentless rhythm, a constant reminder of the powerful and unpredictable forces that had shaped their lives. The dusty attic air hung thick with the scent of mothballs and forgotten memories. Arthur, his usually impeccably tailored suit rumpled, sifted through brittle photographs and yellowed documents. Sunlight streamed through a grimy window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the silent space. Guilt gnawed at him, a persistent ache mirroring the throbbing in his temples. He unearthed a faded ledger, its pages brittle with age, detailing Blackwood family finances stretching back generations. A name, almost illegible, caught his eye: Isabelle Dubois. His heart pounded. Isha's birth name. He found another photo, tucked inside the ledger, a snapshot of a young woman, strikingly similar to Isha, cradling a newborn. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but the resemblance was undeniable. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him. This was more than coincidence. This was a deliberate attempt to erase Isha from their history. Later that evening, Arthur sat across from Isha in their quiet living room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. He held the photograph, its edges worn and fragile. He saw the uncertainty in Isha's eyes mirroring his own. "Isha," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "I found this. It's a picture of your mother, I think." Isha's breath hitched. Her fingers, usually so graceful, trembled as she reached for the photograph. The firelight glinted off the tears welling in her eyes. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the crackling fire, a stark contrast to the storm raging within them both. "My mother," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never knew her." Arthur nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his family's deceit pressed down on him, crushing him under its immense burden. He felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards the family who had kept this secret, who had stolen a piece of Isha's life, and in doing so, stolen a piece of his heart. This wasn't just about a marriage. It was about justice, truth, and the desperate need to mend the wounds inflicted by years of calculated lies. The fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The mahogany table in the Blackwood family dining room felt cold beneath Arthur's hands. The air, thick with unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. He slammed the ledger down, the brittle pages fluttering like frightened birds. Beatrice, her face a mask of controlled fury, stared at him. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to vibrate with barely contained rage. "This," Arthur said, his voice shaking slightly, "is proof, Isabelle Dubois. Your ledger, your deliberate attempt to erase Isha from our history." Beatrice's laughter was brittle, devoid of humor. Sentimental rubbish. Old records, full of inaccuracies. She reached for a crystal glass, her hand trembling ever so slightly. "Inaccuracies? This photograph," Arthur held up the faded image, "shows a woman remarkably like Isha, holding a newborn. This isn't coincidence, Beatrice. This is calculated cruelty." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. Isha, her face pale but resolute, stood at the doorway, the firelight painting shadows on her somber features. She hadn't spoken, yet her presence was a tangible force. "Arthur," Beatrice's voice was a low hiss, "you're letting this woman manipulate you. She's a gold digger, using you for your money." Arthur's gaze hardened. "That's what you wanted me to believe, but I see the truth now. Your racism, your greed, your desperation to maintain your control. It's all laid bare." He looked at Isha, his eyes softening. "And I'm sorry, Isha. So sorry for the pain they've caused you." Isha stepped forward, her voice quiet but strong. "I've forgiven them, Arthur, but I won't forget, and neither should you. The weight of years of unspoken hurt, of lost identity, hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The family's carefully constructed facade of wealth and respectability had crumbled. The truth, raw and ugly, had finally come to light. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Arthur and Isha felt a shared strength, a bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and revelation. They were facing the future together. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket woven from years of deceit and unspoken resentments. Arthur watched Isha, the flickering firelight painting shifting shadows on her face, highlighting the subtle tremor in her hand as she clutched a worn photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, her face obscured by shadow, holding a baby that bore an uncanny resemblance to Isha. This is my mother? Isha whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The question hung unanswered, a silent testament to the gaping holes in her past. Arthur reached out, his touch hesitant, covering her hand with his. "We'll find out," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Together, we'll uncover everything." His own guilt gnawed at him, a bitter taste on his tongue. He had been complicit in his family's cruelty, blinded by their wealth and societal pressures. The following days were a blur of frantic activity. Arthur, fueled by guilt and a burgeoning love for Isha, delved into the family archives, poring over dusty ledgers and yellowed documents. He unearthed more secrets, hushed whispers of a hospital fire, a frantic search for a missing infant, a trail of deliberate omissions and carefully constructed lies. Each discovery was a fresh wound, tearing away at the carefully crafted facade of his family's perfect world. One evening, amidst piles of documents, a faded newspaper clipping caught his eye. A headline screamed about the devastating fire at St. Jude's Hospital, detailing the chaos and the tragic loss of life. Further down, a smaller article mentioned a surviving infant, a little girl found miraculously unharmed amidst the debris. The description, though vague, resonated with Isha's story. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His family hadn't just tried to break up his marriage. They had erased a part of Isha's life, stolen her identity, and condemned her to a lifetime of uncertainty. The betrayal was profound, a chasm of pain that threatened to swallow him whole. He knew then that the fight was far from over. He had to expose the truth not just for Isha, but for himself, for the redemption of his soul. The confrontation with his family would be brutal, but he was prepared. He had found his voice, his purpose, solidified in the unwavering love he felt for Isha, a woman who had endured immeasurable pain with a quiet strength that both humbled and inspired him. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows as he stared at the clipping, a fierce determination hardening his gaze. The fight had begun. The air in the Blackwood family mansion crackled with unspoken accusations. Arthur, his face etched with a weariness that belied his wealth, stood before his family, the newspaper clipping clutched in his trembling hand. The scent of old money and simmering resentment hung heavy in the ornate drawing room, the ticking grandfather clock a relentless counter of their mounting guilt. This, Arthur's voice, usually commanding, was now raw with emotion. "This changes everything." He slammed the clipping onto the highly polished mahogany table, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. Beatrice, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming to bristle with defiance, scoffed. "Sentimental rubbish, Arthur. Another one of your eccentricities." Isha, pale but resolute, stood beside him, her hand finding his. The warmth of his touch, a small comfort in the storm brewing around them, sent a ripple of strength through her. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on her face, emphasizing the deep lines of exhaustion etched beneath her eyes. She had endured so much, yet her gaze held an unwavering strength that silenced even Beatrice's barbed words. "It's not rubbish, Beatrice." Arthur's voice hardened. "This proves Isha is your niece. My niece." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The revelation hung between them, a tangible thing, silencing the room except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The scent of lilies, usually a symbol of peace in this room, now felt suffocating. "Nonsense," Beatrice's voice, sharp as shattered glass, cut through the silence. A coincidence, a cruel joke of fate. This changes nothing. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking support that wasn't forthcoming. The faces of her siblings, usually so impenetrable, were now etched with a mixture of shock and shame. Arthur met his sister's gaze, his eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. It changes everything, Beatrice. It exposes your lies, your manipulations, your racism. The last word hung in the air, a stark condemnation. He saw a flicker of something akin to fear in Beatrice's eyes, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. He knew then that he had finally broken through. Isha squeezed his hand, a silent testament to their shared journey. The weight of the revelation, the years of deceit, the pain, it all coalesced into a potent mixture of grief and determination. This fight wasn't just about their marriage. It was about Isha's stolen identity, their family's collective shame, and the relentless fight for truth and justice. The battle lines had been drawn. The fight for their future had begun. The scent of lilies seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp, bitter smell of exposed lies. The mahogany table, scarred by generations of Blackwood family dinners, seemed to absorb the weight of Arthur's accusation. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken resentments, vibrated with the unspoken. Beatrice, her carefully constructed composure cracking, sputtered a denial, her voice a brittle counterpoint to the grandfather clock's measured tick. It's absurd, a ridiculous fabrication. Isha, her hand still clasped tightly in Arthur's, felt a tremor run through her. The revelation, so shattering, was only the beginning. The years of subtle slights, the veiled racism, the constant undercurrent of disapproval, it all coalesced into a suffocating wave of exhaustion. Yet, in Arthur's unwavering gaze, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. It's not absurd, Beatrice. Arthur's voice, though strained, held a newfound steel. He met his sister's furious glare head-on. I've spent the last few days piecing together the truth. The hospital records, the adoption papers, they all point to one inescapable conclusion. He paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his words. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the room, highlighting the fear creeping into Beatrice's meticulously crafted facade. You knew, Arthur accused, his voice low and dangerous. You knew all along, and you deliberately withheld the truth. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Beatrice's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of anger and fear. It was for the best, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. For the family, for Arthur. The words, intended as a justification, felt like a fresh wound to Isha. The self-serving nature of Beatrice's actions, veiled under the guise of family protection, sparked a cold fury within her. She pulled her hand free from Arthur's, the sudden absence leaving a cold space in her chest. The warmth of his touch, her only anchor in this storm, was gone. For Arthur, Isha's voice, low and steady, carried an icy undertone that surprised even herself. You used my stolen identity to secure your brother's happiness? To maintain your family's image? The last word hung in the air, heavy with contempt. The meticulously crafted facade of the Blackwood family crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The scent of lilies felt almost toxic now, the sweetness masking the bitterness of long-held secrets and ingrained prejudices. The weight of the past, the years of deception, pressed down on them all. The battle for their future had truly begun. The firelight danced across the faded photographs scattered on Arthur's desk, illuminating Isha's face in a surprisingly familiar way. A younger Isha, perhaps 5 years old, clutched a worn teddy bear, her dark eyes mirroring the deep sadness in the sepia tones. Beside her, a blurred figure, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, barely discernible in the grainy image. Arthur traced the lines of the photograph, a lump forming in his throat. This is your mother? Isha asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hand hovering over the image. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken history and shared loss. Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the woman's face. "I found this in my mother's old trunk," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "It's from before the fire, before everything changed." He reached for Isha's hand, his touch gentle, respectful. The warmth of his touch, after the chill of Beatrice's accusations, brought a spark of comfort, chasing away the lingering shadows of doubt and betrayal. Isha's breath hitched, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. The photograph wasn't just a picture. It was a connection, a tangible link to a past she had never known, a past shared with the man she loved. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never knew I had a mother who looked like that." She leaned into Arthur, her tears soaking his shirt. The scent of her perfume, a delicate blend of lavender and rose, mixed with the smell of old paper and dust from the antique trunk. He held her close, a silent promise of comfort and support amidst the storm of their shared history. The photograph, a simple snapshot, held a power beyond its physical form. It was a bridge across the chasm of time and loss, a testament to the enduring strength of family bonds, however fractured they might be. The discovery was a step forward, a small victory in their battle to reclaim their future from the ashes of the past. The weight of the past was still heavy, but now at least they carried it together. The antique grandfather clock in Arthur's study chimed 11, each toll a hammer blow against the fragile piece. Dust motes danced in the moonlight filtering through the tall windows, illuminating the hesitant smiles exchanged between Arthur and Isha. The photograph, a tangible link to Isha's past, lay between them on the polished mahogany desk. Its scent, a faint whisper of aged paper and forgotten moments, hung in the air. "It's unbelievable," Isha breathed, her fingers tracing the blurred outline of the woman's face. The resemblance was undeniable, a ghostly echo in the younger Isha's eyes. A wave of sadness, sharp and sudden, washed over her. "I feel like a ghost, Arthur. A ghost who finally found her reflection." Arthur reached across the space separating them, his touch gentle on her hand. The warmth of his touch, a small act of comfort, eased the chill that had settled deep within her. "You're not a ghost, my love," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're family, and you're finally home." He recounted the details of his investigation, the hushed conversations with distant relatives, the piecing together of fragmented memories, the slowly unfolding truth. The weight of his family's secrets, their decades of denial and prejudice, pressed heavily on his shoulders. He felt the shame of it all, a burning brand against his conscience. Isha listened, her eyes wide with a mixture of sorrow and dawning understanding. The revelation was a double-edged sword. The joy of finally knowing her origins was tempered by the bitter knowledge of her family's past actions, their cruel indifference to her plight. A tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek, reflecting the moonlight. "They tried to break us," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Because of the color of my skin, because of who they thought I was." The unspoken accusation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Arthur pulled her close, holding her tightly as the full weight of his family's actions crashed down upon him. The anger was a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in its fury, but he held it back, determined to focus on Isha, on the truth they had uncovered together. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, that confronting his family would be a battle fought on multiple fronts. But as he looked into Isha's tear-filled eyes, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The photograph, a fragile link to the past, became a symbol of their shared future, a promise of a love strong enough to withstand the storm. The silence that followed was a profound one, filled with a shared understanding, a silent vow to face the complexities of their relationship and the challenges to come together. The clock ticked on, marking the passage of time, the slow but steady unfolding of their truth. The antique grandfather clock's chime, a mournful 11, echoed Arthur's own internal turmoil. He sat across from Isha, the The photograph, a faded image of a young woman strikingly similar to Isha, cradled in the arms of a woman who bore a faint resemblance to Beatrice, resting between them. The scent of old paper and faded ink filled the air, a tangible link to a past shrouded in secrecy and pain. Isha's fingers traced the blurred outline of the woman's face, her breath catching in her throat. "It's her," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a bittersweet wave of recognition washing over her. Tears welled in her eyes, reflecting the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. "My mother!" Arthur reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch, a small gesture of comfort, eased the tremor in her fingers. "We need to find out," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The weight of his family's deception pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. He'd spent weeks painstakingly piecing together the fragments of his family's hidden history, unearthing long-buried secrets that shattered the comfortable facade of his privileged upbringing. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Isha's grief was palpable, a raw, open wound. She'd been robbed of her identity, her past, her family. The knowledge that Beatrice, the woman who had orchestrated the DNA test to break up their marriage, was likely implicated in her adoption, intensified her pain. The anger simmered beneath the surface, a volcanic fury threatening to erupt. Arthur knew he had to act. He had to confront his family, expose their lies, and fight for Isha, for their love, for the truth. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the photograph, this fragile link to Isha's past, became a symbol of their shared future. He squeezed her hand, offering unspoken support, a silent promise to navigate the storm together. "We'll find out who your parents were, Isha. We'll uncover the truth, no matter the cost." His voice resonated with a newfound resolve, a determination born of love and a burning desire to right the wrongs of the past. The moonlight bathed them in a silvery glow, highlighting the determination etched on their faces. As they stared into each other's eyes, a shared commitment to face the darkness together and emerge into the light. The faded photograph, a tangible link to Isha's past, lay between them, a silent witness to their burgeoning investigation. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams, slicing through the library's tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings on the antique desk. The air, heavy with the scent of aged leather and polished wood, hummed with unspoken tension. Isha's fingers, still trembling slightly, traced the outline of the woman's face in the photograph. Her mother? A ghost of a smile played on her lips, a fragile expression of tentative hope. "It's uncanny," she whispered, her voice catching. The resemblance was undeniable, a striking echo across decades. The sorrow in her eyes, however, spoke volumes of the pain of a life lived without knowledge of her origins. Arthur reached across the desk, his hand gently covering hers. The warmth of his touch was a balm to her frayed nerves. He felt the tremor in her fingers, a physical manifestation of her emotional turmoil. He understood her pain. He felt it too, a mirror image of his own guilt and self-recrimination. "We'll find out," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. "We'll find out everything." He felt the weight of his family's deceit crushing down on him, a burden he couldn't bear alone. He had to confront them, expose their lies, reclaim the truth for Isha. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about justice, about healing a deep, festering wound that ran through generations of his family. Isha leaned into his touch, finding solace in his unwavering support. The fear that had consumed her for weeks began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. His quiet strength, his unwavering commitment, was a lifeline in this turbulent sea of uncertainty. "But what if they were involved in my adoption?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. The question hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken implication of betrayal. The thought of Beatrice, the architect of their initial turmoil, having a hand in Isha's separation from her family, was almost unbearable. Arthur's jaw tightened. The possibility was horrifying, a grim confirmation of his family's capacity for cruelty and deception. He squeezed her hand, offering silent reassurance. "We will find out, Isha," he vowed, his voice firm, laced with a determination that mirrored the steel in her gaze. "And then we'll make them pay." The anger simmered beneath the surface, a powerful current fueling their shared resolve. The photograph, once a symbol of mystery, now served as a beacon, guiding them toward the truth and toward a future they were determined to build together, regardless of the obstacles ahead. The news hit Isha like a physical blow, the lawyer's crisp pronouncements echoing in the sterile office. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, glinted off the polished mahogany desk. "Due to the recently discovered familial relationship," the lawyer droned, "the marriage is legally void." Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded Isha. Then, a chilling emptiness followed. No more scheming relatives, no more veiled threats. But what now? Arthur, beside her, his hand clasped tightly in hers, felt the shift in her demeanor, the sudden draining of her vibrant energy. He knew the relief was a fragile mask. The drive home was silent, the city's cacophony a muffled roar against the quiet despair swirling in the car. Arthur's jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The weight of his family's actions, of his own inaction, pressed heavily on him. He'd failed Isha. Again. He pulled into their driveway, the grand Blackwood mansion looming, a monument to the family's wealth and, now, its dysfunction. "It's strange," Isha finally said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the oppressive silence. The scent of honeysuckle, usually so comforting, now felt cloying, suffocating. Free, but lost. Arthur pulled her close, the leather of the car seat cool against her cheek. He didn't offer platitudes, words felt insufficient. He just held her, letting the silence speak volumes of shared understanding, of shared grief. The weight of his family's sins felt heavier than ever, the knowledge that they'd tried to destroy their love, even unknowingly, a searing brand. Inside, the house felt cold, the opulent furnishings mocking their emotional desolation. Arthur poured them both brandy, the rich amber liquid a stark contrast to the pale apprehension etched on Isha's face. He watched her sip it slowly, her eyes distant, lost in the maze of her thoughts. He knew they had to face the reality of their situation, to navigate this unexpected legal quagmire, and to confront the lingering shadow of his family's prejudice. The invalid marriage was just the beginning. Their true fight had just begun. The fight for their love, for their future, a future that, only moments ago, had seemed so bright and secure now lay in uncertain ruins. But in the warmth of his embrace, surrounded by the cold elegance of his family home, he knew, with a certainty that transcended the legal void, that he wouldn't let go. He wouldn't let them go. Not now. Not ever. The silence in the car stretched, thick and heavy as the humid summer air. Isha stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. The relief she'd felt at the lawyer's words had evaporated, leaving behind a desolate emptiness. Arthur reached across the console, his hand covering hers. His touch was a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough with unshed tears. The word felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Isha squeezed his hand, the gesture small but filled with unspoken understanding. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But even to her own ears, the words sounded unconvincing. The weight of her family's secrets, of her own uncertain past, pressed down on her. The Blackwood mansion loomed ahead, its imposing facade a stark contrast to the turmoil within them. As they pulled into the driveway, the scent of honeysuckle, usually so comforting, now felt suffocating, a sickly sweet reminder of a life turned upside down. Inside, the opulent furnishings seemed to mock their emotional desolation. The grand hall, usually filled with the buzz of family gatherings, was eerily silent. Arthur poured them brandy, the amber liquid shimmering in the dim light. He watched as Isha took a slow sip, her eyes distant, lost in the labyrinth of her thoughts. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, unspoken yet overwhelmingly present. It was a question about their marriage, their future, their whole lives. Arthur met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, determination, and love. "We fight for this," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "We fight for us." He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. His family's prejudices were deep-rooted, their manipulations relentless. But he wouldn't let go. Not for anything. He wouldn't let this invalid marriage define them. He would fight for their love, their future against all odds. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a battle cry for a love that deserved to survive. The fight for their love had just begun. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Isha's hands. The brandy, a fiery liquid meant to soothe, only burned a path down her throat, leaving a bitter residue. Arthur sat opposite, his usual jovial countenance replaced by a haunted stillness. The opulent dining room, usually vibrant with laughter, felt like a tomb. Outside, the summer night hummed with unseen life, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence within. "So," Isha began, her voice a fragile whisper against the hushed grandeur, "we're unmarried." The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The relief she'd initially felt had curdled into a bitter taste of uncertainty. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling amber liquid in his glass. "Legally, yes, but..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "That doesn't change how I feel." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the strain beneath his carefully constructed composure. Isha looked away, her eyes tracing the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, the family's cruel machinations, the revelation of her hidden past, the sudden, unexpected void where her marriage should have been. "It changes everything," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It feels like we built something on sand." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch, warm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the churning sea of her emotions. "No, Isha," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "We built something real. This legal technicality doesn't erase that." His eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, were now filled with a fierce determination that resonated with the warmth of his hand. The scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the open window, a bittersweet reminder of their stolen moments, their burgeoning love, threatened now by the harsh reality of their situation. The fire in the hearth crackled, a comforting counterpoint to the storm brewing within them. The fight for their love, he knew, was far from over. It had only just begun. The news hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the humid summer air clinging to the opulent Blackwood mansion. Isha stared out the French doors, the manicured gardens a blur of green and gold. The relief, sharp and sudden as a knife's edge, had faded, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Unmarried?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. It wasn't the scandal, the family's cruel betrayal, or even the shattering revelation of her hidden past that stung most. It was the uncertainty, the sudden chasm where a solid future had stood. Arthur approached, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture both gentle and tentative. The weight of his touch was heavy with unspoken apologies, with the crushing weight of his family's failings. "I know this isn't what we planned, Isha," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but this doesn't change us." She turned, her eyes mirroring the storm raging within. "Doesn't it, Arthur? Everything we built, it's invalid. A secret, a legal loophole. It's all unraveling." The scent of lilies, usually a soothing fragrance in the drawing room, now felt cloying, suffocating, mirroring the claustrophobia in her chest. He pulled her close, the warmth of his embrace a fragile comfort against the chill in the air. "We fight for this, Isha. We fight for us." His voice was a low rumble, a promise whispered against the backdrop of her despair. The determination in his eyes, the steadfastness in his grip, was a beacon in her growing storm. The sunlight, streaming through the French doors, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden beams, a symbol, perhaps, of the fragility of their situation. Yet, in the quiet intensity of their embrace, a new resolve began to bloom, a stubborn seed of hope pushing through the hardened earth of betrayal and uncertainty. The fight for their love, now armed with a knowledge of its precariousness, had truly begun. The invalidity of their marriage wasn't an ending. It was a challenge. The Blackwood mansion, usually a haven of opulent calm, felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall windows, each a tiny, glittering reminder of the fragility of their situation. Isha sat on the chaise lounge, the plush velvet doing little to soften the hardness of the news. The scent of lilies, usually comforting, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Arthur paced, the polished mahogany floor echoing the frantic rhythm of his steps. "Invalid," he muttered, the word a bitter pill on his tongue. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture reflecting his inner turmoil. His usually sharp eyes were clouded with exhaustion and a deep, gnawing guilt. The weight of his family's actions, his own complicity in their blindness, pressed down on him. Isha watched him, her expression a mask of controlled sadness. The initial relief at the revelation of the legal loophole had quickly evaporated, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. "It's not just the marriage, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's everything." He stopped pacing, turning to face her. The lines of worry etched around his eyes deepened. "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'll fix it. Promise. We'll get married again. Legally this time. Properly." His words, though meant to reassure, sounded hollow even to his own ears. Isha sighed, a soft, weary sound that carried the weight of unspoken fears. "It's more than that," she repeated, her gaze drifting to the garden beyond the French doors. "It's the family, Arthur. The lies, the betrayal. How can we ever trust them again? How can we build a future with this shadow hanging over us?" A single tear traced a path down her cheek, catching the light like a tiny, glittering shard of glass. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken anxieties. The opulent setting felt like a gilded cage, trapping them in the aftermath of their shattered dreams. The weight of their predicament was almost tangible, pressing down on them like the humid summer air. Arthur moved closer, kneeling beside her, his touch gentle and reassuring. He couldn't fix everything, not instantly, but he could offer her the comfort of his presence, the strength of his unwavering love. "We'll face this together, Isha," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "Together." He gently wiped away her tear, his thumb brushing against her soft skin. The simple gesture, laden with unspoken promises, held a quiet strength, a fragile hope amidst the storm. The weight of the invalid marriage hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid summer air clinging to the Blackwood mansion. Isha stared out at the meticulously manicured lawns, the vibrant green a stark contrast to the bleakness she felt inside. The lilies, once a symbol of Arthur's extravagant affection, now felt like a mocking reminder of their precarious situation. She picked at a loose thread on the chaise lounge, the plush velvet offering no comfort. "It's not just the legality, Arthur," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The scent of lilies, once so intoxicating, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring her own internal turmoil. Arthur, pacing restlessly by the French doors, stopped. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. He ran a hand through his silvering hair, the gesture revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I know," he said, his voice rough, laced with self-reproach. "My family, their actions, they've poisoned everything." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "It's the betrayal, Arthur," Isha continued, her voice cracking slightly. "The lies, the scheming, is not just about a piece of paper, it's about trust. About everything we thought we knew. A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant chirping of crickets. He knelt beside her, his touch gentle, his eyes brimming with a mixture of remorse and love. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't try to fix it instantly. Instead, he simply offered his presence, the unspoken promise of unwavering support. "We'll navigate this together," he murmured, his voice low and steady, a comforting counterpoint to the turmoil swirling within her. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch a silent affirmation of his commitment. "Together, we'll face this storm." The words, though simple, held the weight of his promise, a fragile beacon of hope amidst the wreckage of their shattered dreams. The opulent setting, usually a source of comfort and security, felt suffocating, a gilded cage trapping them in the aftermath of their family's cruel machinations. But in his eyes, Isha found a flicker of renewed strength, a promise that even amidst this chaos, their love, stronger than any legal loophole, would prevail. The mahogany table in Arthur's study felt cold beneath Isha's hands. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the ancient oaks, mirroring the turmoil within her. Arthur sat opposite, his face etched with worry lines that deepened with each passing moment. The legal document, confirming their marriage's invalidity, lay between them, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. "It feels surreal," Isha finally said, her voice catching. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken anxieties. She traced the rim of her teacup, the delicate china cold against her fingertips. The Earl Grey, usually a soothing ritual, offered no comfort tonight. "I know," Arthur murmured, his gaze distant. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture revealing the strain he was under. "My family, they've done this. They've deliberately sabotaged our happiness." His voice cracked, a raw vulnerability she hadn't seen before. The weight of his guilt was palpable. "But it's not just them, Arthur," Isha whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "It's everything. The lies, the secrecy, this whole revelation. It's shaken me to my core." She looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, reflecting the flickering gaslight in the room. A bitter wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Arthur rose, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He walked to the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the stormy sky. "We'll fix this, Isha," he said, his voice low and determined, yet tinged with uncertainty. "We'll find a way. We have to." Isha watched him, her heart aching. His resolve, though strong, felt fragile. The invalid marriage wasn't just a legal problem. It was a symbol of the deep-seated mistrust, the insidious poison his family had injected into their relationship. The fight ahead wouldn't just be a legal battle. It would be a fight for their love, for their future, against the weight of generations of prejudice and deceit. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within their hearts. But as she watched Arthur's resolute back, a spark of hope ignited within her. They would face this together, she vowed. Together, they would weather this storm. The days that followed were a blur of legal jargon and hushed conversations. The grand Blackwood estate, usually a bastion of boisterous family gatherings, was draped in a suffocating silence. Isha found herself adrift, the familiar comfort of Arthur's love suddenly destabilized by the chilling reality of their invalid marriage. The antique grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, each chime a sharp reminder of time slipping away. "I feel adrift," Isha confessed one evening, her voice barely a whisper above the crackling fireplace. Arthur sat beside her, his hand gently covering hers. The warmth of his touch offered little solace. He knew the legal battle ahead would be arduous, but the emotional toll was far greater. "I know, my love," Arthur replied, his voice thick with remorse. "My family, their actions have shattered something precious, and I'm responsible." He squeezed her hand, the gesture conveying the weight of his guilt. The scent of wood smoke and old books hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the lightness that once defined their relationship. Isha stared into the flames, their flickering light reflecting in her troubled eyes. The revelation of her blood ties to the Blackwood family, initially a source of shock, had been overshadowed by the devastating blow of their invalid union. The joy of rediscovering family had been twisted into a tool of manipulation. The bitter taste of betrayal lingered. "It's not just the marriage, Arthur," she said, her voice laced with a quiet strength he admired. "It's the lies, the way they treated me, all those subtle slights, the veiled racism. And now this. It's like they've tried to erase me twice." He pulled her close, his arms offering a haven against the storm raging within her. The silence that followed was not oppressive, but rather a shared space of grief and understanding. They sat together, enveloped in the warmth of the fire, the weight of their problems a tangible presence between them, yet bound together by a love they were determined to fight for. The fight ahead was not just a legal battle but a fight for the right to love, regardless of blood ties or social constructs. The future remained uncertain, but in each other's arms, they found the courage to face it. The mahogany table in Beatrice's study felt cold beneath Isha's fingertips. Sunlight, slanting through the leaded windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, a silent testament to the neglect that mirrored the family's treatment of her. Beatrice, perched regally in her armchair, regarded Isha with a thinly veiled contempt. The scent of lilies, Beatrice's favorite, hung heavy, a cloying sweetness that felt suffocating. "This unfortunate situation," Beatrice began, her voice smooth as polished marble, "presents a rather convenient opportunity." Isha's gaze hardened. "Convenient for whom, exactly?" Beatrice steepled her fingers. "Arthur's financial situation is, shall we say, precarious. The divorce, coupled with certain legal challenges regarding the Blackwood Trust, could leave him vulnerable." Her eyes glittered. "Imagine the implications." Isha felt a chill crawl down her spine. "You're threatening him?" "Merely suggesting a pragmatic solution," Beatrice corrected, her voice dripping with icy sarcasm. "A swift, amicable separation would be in everyone's best interest. Arthur would retain his standing, and you'd receive a generous settlement. Enough to ensure your comfort, I assure you." Isha's breath hitched. The audacity of it. To casually propose a financial bargain over the wreckage of her marriage. A marriage rendered invalid by a family secret they themselves had unearthed. The injustice burned, a white-hot anger rising within her. She rose from her chair, the polished wood creaking under her weight. "You think money can buy my silence? You think it can erase what you've done?" Her voice shook with barely controlled rage, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "You've betrayed me, Arthur, and you've betrayed yourself, and I won't let you get away with it." Beatrice's smile faltered, a crack appearing in her carefully constructed facade. For the first time, Isha saw a flicker of something akin to fear in her eyes. The carefully orchestrated plan, the calculated manipulations, seemed to falter under the weight of Isha's unyielding spirit. The sunlight, once a symbol of oppressive elegance, now seemed to illuminate Isha's newfound strength. She stood tall, a quiet warrior facing down a lifetime of inherited prejudice. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, in the heart of the Blackwood's cold, echoing study, Isha knew she wouldn't yield. The fight for her love, her future, and her dignity had only just begun. The stale air of the Blackwood mansion hung heavy with unspoken accusations. Arthur paced the library, the worn Persian rug muffling his restless steps. The scent of old leather and dust did little to soothe his frayed nerves. Isha sat by the fire, its warmth doing little to thaw the icy chill that had settled in her heart. The invalidity of their marriage, a legal technicality born from a family secret, hung between them like a shroud. "It's absurd," Arthur finally said, his voice tight with frustration. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "My own family, conspiring to tear us apart." Isha looked up, her eyes mirroring his turmoil. The firelight danced in their depths, highlighting the unshed tears clinging to her lashes. "They didn't account for the strength of our love," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. But beneath the quiet words, a deeper current of uncertainty flowed. The legal loophole was a gaping wound, exposing the fragility of their union. A bitter laugh escaped Arthur's lips. "Love? They think money can buy everything, Isha." Beatrice believes she can manipulate this situation to her advantage, to control the family fortune. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. His gaze, usually filled with warmth, was clouded with a weary despair. "She's trying to use this legal technicality to pressure me into a divorce." Isha's hand instinctively went to her stomach, a subtle gesture betraying the fear that gnawed at her. The thought of losing Arthur, of having their love dismissed as a mere inconvenience, was unbearable. "We won't let her," she stated, her voice gaining strength. A defiant spark ignited in her eyes, mirroring the stubborn flame in the hearth. "We'll fight for this, Arthur. For us." The determination in her voice surprised even herself. The initial shock and confusion over the invalid marriage were slowly giving way to a fierce resolve. She would not be silenced, nor would she be broken. The fight had only just begun, and she was ready. The weight of the Blackwood family's legacy pressed down on them. But their love, fragile as it might seem in the face of such adversity, held a strength neither of them had anticipated. Their shared vulnerability, forged in the crucible of betrayal and revelation, was slowly transforming into a resolute unity. The battle was theirs to fight, and they would face it together. The mahogany table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Beatrice's lawyer's office, a stark contrast to the opulent, dimly lit rooms of the Blackwood mansion. The air here smelled of expensive perfume and nervous sweat. Beatrice, perched regally on a plush chair, tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against a document. Her lips curled in a smug smile. Arthur sat opposite, his usually impeccable suit rumpled, his face etched with exhaustion. Isha sat beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his, her knuckles white. "As you can see," Beatrice purred, her voice a silken weapon, "the marriage is null and void, a simple matter of correcting a clerical oversight." The lawyer, a thin man with shifty eyes, nodded in agreement, shuffling papers. Arthur felt a cold dread grip his heart. He'd known the legal ramifications, but hearing them articulated so coldly, so clinically, was devastating. He glanced at Isha. Her face was pale, but her eyes, though filled with pain, held a flicker of defiance. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support. "This isn't over," Arthur said, his voice low and strained. The words felt fragile, inadequate against the weight of Beatrice's smug satisfaction. "Oh, but it is, darling brother," Beatrice countered, her smile widening. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to see the family fortune diluted further." Her words were a venomous dart, aimed directly at Arthur's vulnerability. He knew she was using the invalid marriage as leverage, threatening to further fracture the already shattered family. Isha's breath hitched. The casual cruelty of Beatrice's words, the blatant disregard for their feelings, ignited a fire within her. She'd initially felt relief at the invalidity of the marriage, a loophole that rendered Beatrice's machinations pointless. But this new attack, this cruel manipulation of their situation, threatened to extinguish that fragile hope. This wasn't just about a legal technicality anymore. It was a war, and Beatrice was determined to win. Arthur straightened, a new resolve hardening his features. He would not let Beatrice dictate their lives. He would fight for Isha, for their love, for their future. He looked at Isha, meeting her gaze. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a steely determination that mirrored his own. They were in this together. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The lawyer's office felt sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth Isha craved. The scent of lemon polish couldn't mask the underlying chill. Beatrice, radiating triumph, watched as Arthur's shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, the fight draining from his usually vibrant eyes. Isha squeezed his hand, the rough texture of his tweed a grounding presence amidst the swirling chaos. "So, it's over?" Isha whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Arthur didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the document detailing the marriage's nullity. The crisp white paper seemed to mock their shattered hopes. The weight of his family's disapproval, of years of ingrained prejudice, pressed down on him, suffocating. Beatrice, however, was far from done. A cruel smile played on her lips, stretching her already sharp features. "Not quite," she purred, her voice laced with a venomous sweetness. "This inconvenience presents a rather interesting opportunity." Isha felt a cold dread. Beatrice's words slithered, each syllable dripping with manipulation. She leaned closer to Arthur, her breath catching in her throat. "What opportunity?" Arthur's voice was strained, laced with the quiet fury simmering beneath his despair. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes glinting with malice. "Think of it, Arthur. The Blackwood fortune, unburdened by unsuitable alliances. A clean slate. With a little persuasion, we could ensure a far more appropriate future for the family." Her words were a veiled threat, a clear attempt to use Isha's invalid marriage as a tool to maintain her control. The air thickened with tension. The scent of lemon polish now felt acrid, a symbol of the bitter taste of betrayal. Isha's initial relief at the legal loophole had evaporated, replaced by a burning rage. This wasn't about a technicality. It was about power, about maintaining a family structure built on exclusion and prejudice. And Isha would not be a pawn in their game. The lawyer's words hung in the air, a death knell to their hastily formed union. Isha's initial relief, a fragile bubble, popped, leaving behind a hollow ache. The sterile scent of the office, antiseptic and cold, mirrored the icy grip of fear tightening around her heart. Arthur, his face etched with exhaustion, reached for her hand, his touch a lifeline in the swirling chaos. His silence spoke volumes. The weight of his family's disapproval, a suffocating blanket, threatened to smother him. "So, it's over?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the relentless tick-tock of the clock. The question felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to grasp at the slipping reality. Beatrice, however, reveled in their despair. A predatory smile stretched across her face, accentuating the sharp angles of her jaw. The glint in her eyes was not triumph, but something far colder, pure, unadulterated malice. "Not quite," she purred, her voice a silken whisper laced with venom. "This inconvenience presents a rather interesting opportunity." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy with menace. Isha felt a chill crawl down her spine, a primal instinct screaming danger. Arthur's hand tightened in hers, his knuckles white. "What opportunity?" Arthur's voice was low, strained, a dangerous calm masking the simmering fury within. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "The Blackwood fortune, unburdened by unsuitable alliances. A clean slate. With a little persuasion, we could ensure a far more appropriate future for the family." The unspoken threat hung between them, heavier than the silence that followed. It was a blatant attempt to exploit their situation, to use Isha's invalid marriage as leverage to maintain their suffocating control. The lemon polish scent, once subtly irritating, now felt acrid, a bitter reminder of their poisoned reality. Isha's anger, a slow burn previously, erupted into a blazing inferno. This wasn't a simple legal technicality. It was a calculated attack on their love, their future, their very beings. And Isha, finally understanding the depths of their family's cruelty, vowed she would not be a pawn in their twisted game. The fight, she realized, had just begun. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the warring emotions on their faces. The air in Arthur's study, usually fragrant with pipe tobacco, was thick with the unspoken accusations. Isha's fingers traced the rim of her untouched teacup, the delicate china cold against her skin. The invalidity of their marriage, initially a shocking revelation, now felt like a betrayal, a cruel twist of fate orchestrated by those they thought loved them. "This isn't right," Arthur muttered, his gaze fixed on the intricate knotting of the Persian rug. The weight of his family's actions pressed down on him, crushing the fragile hope that had blossomed between him and Isha. He felt the familiar sting of guilt, a constant companion these past few weeks. Isha met his gaze, her eyes, usually sparkling with life, now clouded with a deep sadness. "They think they can just erase us?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the quiet defiance in her tone belied her trembling hands. The lemon-polish scent from Beatrice's earlier visit still clung to the air, a persistent, irritating reminder of her manipulative schemes. "No," Arthur said firmly, his voice gaining strength. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the room. "They won't. We'll fight this. We'll prove them wrong." He reached for her hand, his touch firm and reassuring. But the fear remained, a cold knot in Isha's stomach. The legal loophole, a technicality, felt like a gaping chasm threatening to swallow them whole. The Blackwood fortune, the very thing that had drawn them together, now seemed like a poisoned chalice. The weight of their battle seemed insurmountable, a David and Goliath struggle against a family steeped in privilege and prejudice. "How?" Isha asked, her voice barely above a breath. The doubt, a fragile seed, began to take root in her heart. Could they truly overcome this? Could their love withstand the onslaught of their family's relentless attacks? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, a silent testament to the magnitude of the challenge ahead. But in Arthur's eyes, she saw a flicker of resolve, a determination that mirrored her own. Their fight had begun, and they would fight together. The legal papers lay on the mahogany table, crisp and unforgiving. The scent of old parchment and Arthur's pipe tobacco mingled unpleasantly in the air, a testament to the tense atmosphere. Isha stared at the document, the words blurring through a veil of unshed tears. The invalidity of their marriage felt like a physical blow, a cruel mockery of their burgeoning love. "It's absurd," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The polished surface of the table reflected her tear-filled eyes, mirroring the turmoil within. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Arthur reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, a comforting anchor in the storm raging within her. "We'll fix this, Isha. We will." His voice was firm, yet a tremor betrayed the uncertainty he felt. He knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Beatrice's influence, like a poisonous vine, had snaked its way through the family, poisoning their relationships and twisting their perceptions. "How?" Isha's voice was a fragile question, barely audible above the frantic beat of her own heart. Doubt, a chilling serpent, coiled in her gut. Could their love truly withstand the relentless onslaught of his family's wealth and prejudice? The Blackwood fortune, once a symbol of their unlikely union, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them in a web of legal complexities and family betrayals. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees, their whispers mirroring the turmoil in their hearts. Arthur stood, pulling Isha up with him. He held her close, his arms a protective barrier against the world. "We'll fight them together," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. His words were a promise, a vow etched not just in words, but in the depth of his gaze, the unwavering strength of his embrace. The weight of their battle remained immense, but in that shared moment of vulnerability, a new resolve bloomed. The fight wasn't just about a legal loophole. It was about their love, their future, their shared defiance against a family determined to tear them apart. They would fight for their love, a fight that would test their strength, their resilience, and the very depth of their bond. The lawyer's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "The marriage is null and void," he'd stated, the polished mahogany of his desk reflecting the stark reality of their situation. Isha felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her weak and dizzy. The ornate room, usually a symbol of Arthur's wealth, now felt like a suffocating cage. The scent of expensive leather and old books did little to soothe the turmoil within her. Arthur, sensing her distress, gently took her hand. His touch, usually comforting, felt strangely inadequate. He'd promised to fix this, but the enormity of the task felt crushing. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes, the fragile hope he'd so carefully nurtured now threatened by this legal landmine. "We'll appeal," he said, his voice a low rumble, trying to project strength he didn't entirely feel. "We'll find a way." But the doubt in his own voice was a betrayal. The invalidity of their marriage wasn't just a legal technicality. It was a wound, a gaping hole in the carefully constructed foundation of their love. He saw the reflection of his own uncertainty in Isha's eyes, mirroring the fear that coiled in his own heart. Later, alone in their opulent bedroom, the vastness of the space felt isolating. Isha sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin. The room's opulence mocked her despair. Outside, the city lights twinkled, a distant, indifferent glitter against the darkness that had settled over her. "It's like it never happened," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The words hung in the air, filled with a raw grief that tore at Arthur's heart. He knelt beside her, taking her hand again, his touch softer this time, laced with a quiet desperation. "It did happen, Isha, and we'll make sure it continues. We'll fight for this, for us." His voice cracked slightly, a testament to the emotional toll this was taking. He wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was fighting for his love, for the woman who had shown him a depth of compassion he'd never known. He'd underestimated the power of his family's prejudice, and now he was determined to show them, and most importantly himself, that he was better than that. He would fight for Isha, regardless of the cost. The weight of the lawyer's words pressed down on Arthur, heavier than any legal document. He watched Isha, her face pale and drawn, the vibrant spirit that had initially captivated him dimmed by a profound sorrow. The opulent surroundings of the mahogany desk, the Persian rug, the scent of aging leather, mocked their despair. He wanted to shield her from this crushing reality, but the words, "null and void," echoed relentlessly in his ears. He squeezed her hand, his touch clumsy in its attempt at reassurance. "We'll appeal," he promised, his voice rough around the edges. But the words felt hollow even to him. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war against his family's ingrained prejudices, a fight for the love that had blossomed amidst the storm of their disapproval. Later, in the vastness of their bedroom, the silence amplified their grief. Isha sat on the edge of the bed, the silk sheets cool and unyielding beneath her trembling hands. The city lights, a twinkling tapestry beyond the window, offered no solace. "It's like it never happened," she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. Arthur knelt beside her, his heart aching at her despair. He reached for her hand, his touch gentler this time, infused with a desperate tenderness. "It did happen, Isha, and it will continue to happen. We'll fight for this, for us." His voice cracked, revealing the depth of his own vulnerability. This wasn't merely a legal battle. It was a fight for their love, a testament to their enduring connection against the odds. He had underestimated his family's capacity for cruelty, and now he would fight to show them, and most importantly himself, that he was capable of more than he'd previously believed. He would fight for Isha, regardless of the cost, for he knew now that his love for her was worth any battle. The fight had begun, not just in the courtroom, but within his own soul. The mahogany of Arthur's study felt cold against his skin as he paced. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. Isha sat by the window, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. The silence, thick with unspoken grief, was more agonizing than any shouted argument. I don't understand," Isha finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city. Her fingers traced the delicate rim of a chipped teacup, a small, fragile thing mirroring her own fractured state. Arthur stopped pacing, the weight of his family's actions pressing down on him. He'd spent years blind to their prejudice, a prejudice he now recognized as deeply ingrained within himself. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant, bitter companion. "It's not just the law, Isha," he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's everything they did. The test, the lies, the casual cruelty." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. "I failed you." Isha looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "No, Arthur. You're facing it. You're trying to understand. That's more than most people would ever do." She paused, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "And I know your heart. I saw it the moment we met." He moved towards her, kneeling beside the plush armchair. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, feeling the fragile strength within her grip. The touch ignited a spark, a tiny flame against the darkness of their despair. "We'll fight this, Isha," he said, his voice firmer now, imbued with a newfound resolve, "for us, and for the future we deserve." He looked at her, searching for strength in her eyes, and found it. A defiant glimmer shone there, promising resilience against the onslaught of his family's betrayal. The fight had just begun, but this time it was a fight for their love, their future, their truth. The legal battle loomed, but the war for their hearts was already won. The crisp morning air bit at Arthur's cheeks as he walked, the city a muted gray canvas behind him. He hadn't slept, the weight of his family's actions pressing down like a physical burden. He needed to apologize not just for their actions, but for his own blindness. His internalized prejudices, the casual acceptance of their ingrained racism, now felt like a betrayal far greater than anything Beatrice had orchestrated. He found Isha in the garden, the early sunlight catching the delicate golds in her hair. She sat amongst the frost-kissed roses, her hands gently tracing the velvety petals. The sight of her, serene amidst the chaos he'd unleashed, filled him with a sharp pang of guilt. "Isha," he began, his voice rough, the words caught in his throat, thick with unshed tears. She looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a quiet sadness. "Arthur," she replied, her voice soft, but strong, "I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen." He knelt beside her, the damp earth cold against his knees. "But I allowed it. I failed to see, to speak out. My silence was complicity, and for that, I'm truly sorry." The words felt inadequate, clumsy against the magnitude of his failings. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. The simple gesture held more comfort than any elaborate apology. "I know," she said, her voice laced with understanding, a hint of forgiveness. "But anger is easier than hurt, and I'm hurting." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, the scent of her perfume a grounding presence in the swirling storm of his emotions. He felt the tremor of her silent sobs against his chest, and knew this wasn't just about the invalid marriage or his family's cruelty. It was about the deep wound of betrayal, a wound that time, and only time, would heal. The legal battle loomed, but first they needed to heal each other. He had to prove to Isha, and to himself, that he had truly changed. That the man she loved wasn't the man who had silently condoned his family's hatred. This was a new beginning, one built not on wealth or lineage but on the fragile, yet unbreakable, strength of their love. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the crisp morning air. The scent of damp earth and frost-kissed roses mingled with the sharp tang of his remorse. Arthur watched Isha, her usually vibrant eyes clouded with a sorrow that mirrored his own. The golds in her hair, usually a source of his quiet admiration, seemed dulled by the weight of their shared predicament. He'd apologized, but the words felt flimsy, inadequate against the avalanche of his family's actions. Actions he'd silently condoned. "It wasn't just them, Isha," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It was me too. My silence, my acceptance. It was a betrayal." He felt the tremor in his own voice, a testament to the depth of his shame. Isha's gaze remained fixed on the ground, her fingers tracing the delicate veins of a rose petal. The silence stretched, filled only with the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of a bird. The unspoken accusations hung between them, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I understand," she said, her voice barely a breath. "But understanding doesn't erase the hurt. It doesn't make the betrayal any less real." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the delicate rose petal in her hand. Arthur reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently covering it. The warmth of his touch seemed to offer a small measure of comfort, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their pain. The weight of his family's prejudice, his own complicity, pressed down on him, suffocating. Yet, in Isha's hand, in the shared silence, he found a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild, stronger than before, on a foundation of truth and mutual understanding. The legal battle was still ahead, a formidable challenge, but for now, they had each other. And that, he realized, was everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the air hung thick with unspoken accusations. Isha sat alone in the sunroom, the scent of lilies battling the lingering chill of the autumn air. The rose petal, a fragile reminder of Arthur's apology, lay forgotten on the antique coffee table. She traced the intricate carvings on its surface, the cool wood a stark contrast to the burning anger simmering beneath her skin. Betrayal wasn't just a word. It was a physical weight, crushing her spirit. A soft knock broke the silence. Arthur entered, his face etched with weariness. He carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea a calming balm against the storm raging within him. He placed it gently beside her, his touch hesitant. I didn't mean to leave you like that," he said, his voice a low murmur. Isha didn't meet his gaze. "Your silence spoke volumes, Arthur," she replied, her voice tight with unshed tears. "The silence of a man who allowed his family to tear me apart." He sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "My family's actions, they were horrific. But my silence, my complicity, that's on me. I failed you, Isha. I failed to protect you from their prejudice." She finally looked up, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Protection? You married me knowing what they were capable of." "I was blinded by love," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "By a love that now feels tainted, poisoned by their actions. But I see it now, Isha. I see the ugliness of their racism, the cruelty of their manipulations. And I'm ready to fight for us, to fight for our truth." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle, respectful. The warmth of his touch, coupled with the sincerity in his eyes, offered a fragile beginning to healing. The legal battle loomed, a mountain to climb, but in that moment, amidst the shadows of Blackwood Manor, a flicker of hope ignited. The battle for their marriage was far from over, but the battle for their truth had begun. The scent of wood smoke and old paper clung to the air in Beatrice's study, a stark contrast to the lilies Isha had found so comforting. Beatrice, perched on a velvet chaise lounge, regarded Isha with a chilling calm. The afternoon light, filtering through stained glass windows, painted harsh shadows on her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her jaw. "So, you've come to gloat," Beatrice said, her voice a silken whisper laced with venom. "To revel in your victory." Isha didn't flinch. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface for weeks now burned bright, a fierce, protective flame. "I came to understand why," she replied, her voice steady but edged with controlled fury. "Why you would betray me, your own niece." Beatrice laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Betrayal? My dear Isha, you misunderstand. I was merely protecting the Blackwood name. From you." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken contempt. Isha moved closer, her gaze unwavering. The rich mahogany of the desk seemed to pulse with a silent energy, mirroring the tension between them. "Protecting it from a woman who loved your brother? From a woman who only wanted a family? Tears welled, but Isha refused to let them fall. Beatrice's composure faltered. A flicker of something, guilt, regret, crossed her face before she quickly masked it. Arthur is weak. He's easily swayed. You are a predator, preying on his vulnerability. And you, Isha countered, her voice rising, are a viper, poisoning everything you touch. You tried to destroy my marriage, my life, for your own twisted sense of propriety. Arthur's love is not weakness, Beatrice. It's strength. A strength you'll never understand. She turned, the scent of lilies clinging to her like a shield, leaving Beatrice alone in the dim light of her study, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of an antique clock. The battle for their truth was far from over, but the first blow had been struck. The weight of Beatrice's words hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket woven from years of prejudice and resentment. Isha felt a tremor run through her, not of fear, but of a profound sadness. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of hope, now felt fragile, easily crushed under the weight of the family's cruelty. She left Beatrice's study, the mahogany door closing softly behind her, a final, resounding click sealing their confrontation. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. The crisp autumn air, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, offered a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere within the house. Isha walked towards the sprawling gardens, the meticulously arranged flower beds a jarring juxtaposition to the chaos raging within her heart. She needed space, a quiet moment to process the raw emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. A lone bench sat beneath an ancient oak, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like supplicating arms. Isha sank onto the cold wood, the rough texture grounding her amidst the swirling turmoil within. Tears finally came, hot and heavy, each one a testament to the years of displacement, the pain of betrayal, and the simmering anger she had held captive for so long. The tears flowed freely, cleansing the bitterness, leaving behind a space for something else, a fierce determination. She would not let Beatrice, or anyone else, diminish her. She would fight for her love, for her truth, for the life she had built with Arthur. The memory of Arthur's kind eyes, his unwavering support, brought a flicker of warmth, a fragile ember in the face of the storm. She would not let this break them. This was not just about the legality of their marriage. It was about reclaiming her identity, about dismantling the walls of prejudice that had kept her and Arthur apart. It was about showing Beatrice and the entire Blackwood family the depth of their love, the strength of their bond. She would not surrender. She would fight, and she would win. The sun dipped lower, casting a long golden shadow across the garden, a silent witness to her quiet rebellion. Her path forward would be long and arduous, but the seed of defiance had been planted, and it was taking root. The crisp autumn air bit at Isha's exposed skin as she sat on the bench, the ruff would a cold comfort against her trembling legs. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a beautiful backdrop to her internal turmoil. Beatrice's words echoed in her ears, a venomous sting that refused to fade. He'll tire of you, Isha. It's only a matter of time. A tear escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. Betrayal wasn't just a word. It was a physical weight, a crushing burden she carried on her shoulders. It wasn't just Arthur's family's rejection. It was the echo of a past she barely remembered, a life stolen by fire and shrouded in mystery. The pain of that loss, long dormant, now roared to life. Suddenly, a hand rested gently on her shoulder. Arthur. His presence was a warm balm against the chill wind, his touch grounding, reassuring. Isha, he whispered, his voice low and filled with concern. He sat beside her, the silence between them filled only with the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. She said I'd lose you, Isha finally managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. The words were a confession, a plea for reassurance. Arthur's hand squeezed hers. Don't listen to her, love. She's blinded by her own prejudices. His gaze was steady, his expression unwavering in its love and support. "This isn't about her, Isha. It's about us." He pulled her close, enfolding her in a warm embrace. The scent of his cologne, a familiar comfort, mingled with the damp earth and decaying leaves. She leaned into him, finding solace in his strength, in the unwavering certainty of his love. His presence was a lifeline, pulling her back from the precipice of despair. "We'll face this together," he murmured, his voice a soft rumble against her ear. "We'll fight for what we have." His words were a promise, a vow, a lifeline in the storm. The setting sun cast long shadows, but in Arthur's embrace, Isha felt a flicker of hope, a tenacious flame refusing to be extinguished. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since confronting Beatrice, she felt a renewed strength, a shared determination to overcome the obstacles ahead. They would face Beatrice, the family, and the legal complexities together. Their love, she realized, was stronger than any prejudice, any obstacle. It was a force to be reckoned with. The firelight crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls of Arthur's study. Isha traced the rim of her wine glass, the cool crystal a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from the hearth. Silence hung heavy between them, a tangible thing woven from unspoken fears and anxieties. The invalidity of their marriage loomed, a cold, hard fact refusing to be ignored. "It feels surreal," Isha finally murmured, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. The scent of old books and leather bound the air, a familiar comfort in this unsettling situation. Arthur reached across the small space separating them, his hand covering hers. His touch was gentle, reassuring. "I know, love, but it doesn't change how I feel." His gaze held hers, unwavering, a deep well of affection mirroring the fire's glow. "But it changes everything," Isha countered softly, her eyes welling. The fragility of their situation pressed down on her, a weight she couldn't quite bear. The fear of losing him, of losing the fragile hope that had bloomed amidst the wreckage of family betrayal, threatened to overwhelm her. He pulled her closer, his embrace strong yet tender. The rough texture of his tweed jacket against her cheek was oddly soothing. "We'll navigate this together," he promised, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "We'll find a way. We'll fight for us." The warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against hers, offered a small measure of solace. But the shadow of doubt still lingered, a persistent whisper in the back of her mind. The legal battle ahead loomed, a daunting prospect fraught with uncertainty. Could their love truly withstand the onslaught of family pressures and legal complexities? The question hung unspoken, a heavy weight in the silent space between them, a testament to the emotional stakes of their fight. Yet, in his arms, surrounded by the flickering firelight, Isha found a sliver of hope, a tenacious belief in the strength of their bond, a shared determination to overcome the obstacles that stood in their path. The future remained uncertain, but in that moment, clasped tightly in Arthur's embrace, their love felt invincible. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Arthur's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The remnants of last night's fire still lingered in the air, a faint scent of wood smoke clinging to the heavy drapes. Isha sat at the large oak desk, her fingers tracing the embossed initials AB. The weight of their situation pressed heavily upon her. The invalid marriage, the looming legal battle, the fractured family. Arthur entered, his face etched with worry. He poured 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma momentarily distracting from their anxieties. "I spoke with Mr. Davies," Arthur began, his voice low and hesitant. "He believes we have a fighting chance, but it'll be a long and arduous process." He handed her a steaming mug. The warmth felt comforting against her chilled fingers. Isha nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling coffee. "And Beatrice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The memory of Beatrice's sneering face, her thinly veiled triumph, still stung. Arthur sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. "She's digging in her heels, using this as leverage, trying to control the family finances." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. But there are cracks. I saw a flicker of doubt in Margaret's eyes yesterday. Even Charles seems troubled. A glimmer of hope sparked in his gaze. Isha offered a small, tired smile. "Small victories," she murmured, taking a sip of coffee. The bitterness was strangely grounding. "But we need more than small victories, Arthur. We need a complete shift in their perspective." He nodded, his gaze distant as if wrestling with a problem far bigger than their legal woes. "I'm going to try again to appeal to their sense of decency," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve that resonated with Isha. "To make them see Isha, not as some interloper but as family." The word family hung in the air, fraught with irony and years of painful misunderstanding. "I know you will," Isha replied, her hand reaching across the desk to cover his. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise of shared strength and unwavering support. The sunlight caught the glint of her wedding ring, a symbol of their love, a defiance in the face of adversity. The legal battle lay ahead, a daunting, uncertain path, but in that shared moment of quiet understanding, they found the strength to face it together. Their love, though tested and challenged, remained their anchor, their guiding light in the storm. The scent of lilies, Isha's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the stale tension simmering between her and Arthur's family. Margaret, usually reserved, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Charles, his face pale, avoided eye contact. Only Beatrice remained defiantly unmoved, her expression a mask of cold disapproval. The mahogany table in the opulent dining room seemed to amplify the silence, each tick of the grandfather clock echoing the slow drip of unspoken accusations. I still don't understand," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "A fire. So long ago. It's unbelievable." Isha looked at her, a flicker of understanding softening her gaze. The weight of decades of separation, the pain of a lost identity, ached in her chest. "It's unbelievable to me too," she admitted, her voice low. The years of wondering, of searching for answers, had left a hollow ache that no amount of newfound family could fill. Arthur, his hand resting comfortingly on Isha's, spoke. "We're all grappling with this, trying to understand. It's a shock, yes, but the important thing is—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "The important thing is that we're family now, and we can move forward together." Beatrice scoffed, the sound cutting through the fragile peace. "Family? Don't be ridiculous, Arthur. This changes everything. It invalidates the marriage. And frankly, it's a scandal." Her words, laced with venom, stung Isha more than the initial shock of the revelation. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control, about maintaining the status quo that she had disrupted. A tear escaped Isha's eye, a single drop tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't just the legal ramifications or the family's rejection. It was the crushing weight of being so close yet so far, of belonging yet feeling like an outsider. The unspoken accusations, the veiled prejudices, they were harder to bear than the cold, hard truth of their invalid marriage. This fight was about far more than a signature on a piece of paper. It was about acceptance, about belonging, about finding her place in a family that had rejected her, only to embrace her after a DNA test. The emotional toll, she realized, would be far greater than anyone had anticipated. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the faces gathered in Arthur's study. Isha, nestled in Arthur's embrace, felt the warmth of his body, a stark contrast to the chill in the room. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco mingled with the sweetness of the lilies Arthur had placed on her desk. He'd bought them, she knew, to soften the harsh edges of the revelation. "We need to talk," Arthur said, his voice low and serious. He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them, a tangible presence in the room. The legal invalidity of their marriage wasn't just a technicality. It was a gaping wound, exposing the fragility of their carefully constructed world. Isha nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at Arthur, her eyes searching his. The love she saw there, unwavering and strong, was a lifeline in this storm. "My family," Arthur began, his voice catching slightly. He hesitated, choosing his words with care. They're not all bad. Some are genuinely sorry." He looked at her, his gaze pleading for understanding. The guilt etched on his face was palpable. "I know," Isha replied, her voice softer now, tinged with a quiet sadness. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, relief, betrayal, and now, a cautious hope. The revelation of her past had cracked open her sense of self, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. She clung to Arthur, the steadiness of his love a refuge in the chaos. "But Beatrice, she hasn't changed," Arthur continued, his voice laced with frustration. The image of his sister's cold, disapproving face flashed in his mind. The fight ahead would be arduous, a battle against entrenched prejudice and deep-seated family dynamics. Isha reached out, touching his cheek gently. "We'll face it together," she murmured, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The shared vulnerability, the mutual understanding forged in the crucible of their shared past, strengthened their bond. Their love, tested and refined, shone brighter than the flickering flames in the hearth. The fight for their future had begun. The invalid marriage was not the end, but a new beginning, a chance to rewrite their story, one filled with love and understanding, even amidst the turmoil of their family. The courtroom hummed, a low thrum of hushed voices and rustling papers. Sunlight sliced through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Isha, perched on the edge of her seat, felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The air, thick with legal jargon and unspoken anxieties, tasted metallic. Arthur's hand, warm and reassuring, squeezed hers under the table. His gaze, though filled with a familiar love, held a shadow of worry. "This is ridiculous," Beatrice hissed, her voice a venomous whisper from the gallery. Isha barely registered the words. The venom felt distant, muted by the weight of the proceedings. The judge's voice, crisp and impartial, cut through the tension. "Mr. Blackwood, your testimony, please." Arthur stood, his shoulders squared, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He spoke of his love for Isha, of the pain caused by his family's prejudice, of the journey they had undertaken to find truth and understanding. His words, clear and measured, painted a picture of their relationship, its resilience, its depth, its unwavering commitment. Isha watched him, a lump forming in her throat. His love was a beacon in this storm, a constant source of strength. The fear that gnawed at her, the fear of losing him, of losing the validation she so desperately craved, began to ease, replaced by a quiet certainty. The legal battle wasn't just about legal technicalities. It was about their love story, a testament to their resilience and their shared history. It was a battle against prejudice, against family expectations, against the weight of the past. And in that courtroom, bathed in the cold light of justice, their love story shone brighter than ever before. The emotional toll was immense, but their shared vulnerability only fortified their bond. The outcome remained uncertain, but their love, their shared strength, was undeniable. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation, hung heavy. Isha felt Arthur's hand, a comforting weight in hers, his thumb stroking gentle circles on her knuckles. His eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were shadowed with exhaustion, but their depth held an unwavering love that soothed her frayed nerves. Beatrice, a venomous presence in the gallery, glared, her lips a thin, cruel line. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack in the tense silence. "The court finds in favor of Mr. and Ms. Blackwood," the judge's voice boomed, echoing through the hushed chamber. Relief washed over Isha, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown her. Tears welled, blurring the image of Arthur, his face etched with relief, a slow smile spreading across his features. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. Later, outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warm on Isha's face, a stark contrast to the icy tension of the courtroom. Arthur pulled her close, his embrace a haven. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's really over." "But it's just the beginning," Isha replied, her voice catching in her throat. The legal battle was won, but the emotional scars remained, deep and raw. The journey to heal, to truly reconcile with her newfound family and with her own past, was only just beginning. The weight of the past hung heavy, but now, nestled in Arthur's arms, it felt less oppressive, less insurmountable. The future, while still uncertain, now felt possible, even hopeful. The warmth of his embrace, the steadfastness of his love, gave her the courage to face whatever lay ahead. Their love story, forged in the fires of prejudice and misunderstanding, had emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. The battle had been won, but the true work of building a future together had just begun. The celebratory dinner felt strangely muted. The scent of roasted lamb and rosemary hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the quiet tension simmering beneath the surface. Arthur, his face etched with fatigue, watched Isha pick at her food. The legal victory felt hollow, the weight of unspoken anxieties settling between them like a thick fog. "Are you all right, love?" he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper above the clinking silverware. Isha looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's overwhelming, Arthur." Winning the case felt like escaping a nightmare, but now I'm facing the aftermath. She paused, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The expensive silverware felt cold against her fingertips. Arthur reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch was a grounding force amidst the swirling uncertainty. "We'll face it together, Isha, every step of the way." He knew the legal battle had merely been a battleground for a larger war, the war for acceptance within his family, for healing old wounds, for forging a future free of the shadows of the past. The lingering resentment from Beatrice, despite her outwardly forced politeness, hung like a shroud. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of their bedroom, Isha confessed her fears. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells, Arthur. One wrong move, and everything could shatter again." The silk sheets felt cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of Arthur's embrace as he pulled her close. "It won't shatter, my love," he whispered, his voice a soothing balm. "We'll build something stronger, something more resilient, something built on truth and love, not on the lies and prejudices of the past." He kissed her forehead, his lips lingering there, a silent promise of unwavering support. The room, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. A chapter filled with the daunting but ultimately hopeful task of rebuilding, of healing, of finally finding their peace. The courtroom's sterile scent of antiseptic and old paper clung to Isha's clothes, a lingering reminder of the battle just fought. Outside, the city hummed with life, a stark contrast to the heavy silence in the car as Arthur drove them home. Rain lashed against the windshield, mirroring the storm raging within them. Arthur's hand, resting on the gear shift, was tense. "It's over, Isha," he said, his voice rough. "We won." But the words felt hollow even to him. The victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The legal battle had been grueling, exhausting. A relentless assault on their love, their sanity, their very identities. Isha stared out at the blurred lights, her reflection a ghost in the rain-streaked glass. "Won," she echoed, the word barely a breath. But at what cost? The question hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. The exhaustion etched on Arthur's face was mirrored in the hollow look in Isha's eyes. The legal victory had exposed the deep fissures within his family, wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. Beatrice's venomous glare, even from across the courtroom, still haunted Isha. "We'll rebuild," Arthur said, his voice firmer now, a promise whispered against the drumming rain. "We'll face whatever comes next together." He squeezed her hand, a silent vow of support in the face of lingering uncertainty. He knew the legal win was just the first step, The true battle, the battle for acceptance, for healing, for a future free from the shadows of the past, was yet to begin. The road ahead was long, arduous, and fraught with challenges. But they would face it together. He had to believe that. The judge's gavel fell, a final, resounding thud that echoed the weight of their ordeal. The courtroom, a suffocating space of legal jargon and strained emotions, emptied around them, leaving Arthur and Isha alone in the echoing silence. Sunlight, pale and weak after days of courtroom gloom, slanted through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It felt like a fragile piece, easily shattered. Isha's hand, trembling slightly, reached for Arthur's. His fingers intertwined with hers, a silent reassurance amidst the lingering uncertainty. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse from days of tense anticipation. The victory felt less like triumph and more like a fragile truce. The drive home was a blur of city lights streaking past, the rain a constant, melancholic rhythm against the car's roof. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. The relief was palpable, yet overshadowed by the looming task of healing. Isha finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost lost in the drumming rain. "What now?" Arthur glanced at her, his expression a mixture of love and apprehension. "We rebuild," he said, his voice firm but laced with vulnerability. "We start anew. This isn't just a legal victory, Isha. It's a chance to create something real, something stronger." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise against the storm outside, a testament to their enduring strength. The victory was a beginning, not an end. The real work, the emotional labor of healing and reconciliation, lay ahead. The taste of justice was bittersweet, the future uncertain. Yet their love, tested and tempered by the fire of adversity, burned brighter than ever before. The road ahead was paved with challenges, but hand in hand, they were ready to face them. The celebratory dinner was a subdued affair. The mahogany table, usually gleaming under the chandelier's light, seemed to absorb the joy, leaving only a polished sheen of unspoken anxieties. The aroma of roasted lamb, usually a comfort, hung heavy, a reminder of the opulent life that had nearly been shattered. Arthur, his face etched with weariness, watched Isha across the table. The vibrant sparkle in her eyes, usually so captivating, was dimmed, replaced by a cautious hope. "It's over," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the clinking silverware. She picked at her food, the gesture mirroring the delicate balance of their newfound freedom. Arthur reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch was a silent reassurance, a counterpoint to the chill lingering in the room. "Yes," he said softly, his gaze holding hers. "But the real battle begins now." Beatrice, seated opposite them, remained impassive, her usual sharp features softened by an almost imperceptible hint of regret. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a reminder of time's relentless march. Beatrice began, her voice hesitant, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. "I owe you both an apology." The words hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. A tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the weight of her past actions. Isha looked at her, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. The years of hurt, the betrayal, the manipulation, could these truly be undone? Could forgiveness blossom from such poisoned soil? The weight of the question hung heavy in the air, a challenge neither woman could ignore. Arthur, observing the delicate dance of reconciliation, felt a wave of hope wash over him, a tide pulling against the undertow of the past. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the path forward seemed illuminated by a fragile, yet persistent, light. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Isha sat beside Arthur, her hand clasped tightly in his. His thumb rubbed circles on her knuckles, a silent reassurance against the echoing silence. The judge's gavel, a stark symbol of finality, seemed to hang heavy in the air, a pendulum swinging between their hopes and fears. The lawyer's words, though technically precise, felt like a dull ache in her ears. She focused instead on the warmth of Arthur's hand, a lifeline in the swirling sea of legal jargon. The verdict arrived, sharp and unexpected. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of disbelief washing over the assembled onlookers. The judge declared the marriage null and void, but not for the reason they expected. A technicality, a forgotten clause, a loophole so obscure it had been overlooked by everyone. The relief that flooded Isha was immediate, a tidal wave washing away the lingering fear. But it was short-lived, quickly replaced by a disorienting sense of loss. The battle was won, but the victory tasted like ash. Arthur, sensing her shift in mood, squeezed her hand. His eyes, usually twinkling with humor, were filled with a deep, unwavering concern. "It's not what we wanted," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hushed whispers of the courtroom. "But it's not the end." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll fix this, Isha. We'll find a way." His words, a simple promise, held the weight of a lifetime's devotion. The walk out of the courthouse was a blur of faces, blurred sounds, and the dull ache of disappointment. The crisp autumn air bit at Isha's exposed skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of Arthur's hand still firmly clasped in hers. The sunlight, usually a source of joy, felt harsh and unforgiving. She looked up at Arthur, his profile sharp against the bright sky, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by a determined set of his jaw. "We'll get married again," he stated, more to himself than to her. "Properly this time, with all the legal fuss sorted." His tone was resolute, his gaze steady and firm, giving Isha the courage she needed to face the uncertainty of their future. The courtroom doors swung open, releasing them into the crisp autumn air. Leaves, the color of burnt umber and fiery gold, crunched under their feet, a brittle counterpoint to the tremor in Isha's hands. The legal battle was over, a victory tinged with bittersweetness. The marriage was void, not because of family machinations, but a forgotten legal clause. "It's unexpected," Isha breathed, her voice catching. The relief was palpable, yet the weight of their unconventional situation pressed down. Arthur squeezed her hand, his touch grounding, familiar. "Unexpected, yes, but not insurmountable," he murmured, his gaze locking with hers. The sunlight caught the silver in his temples, highlighting the lines etched by worry, yet his eyes shone with unwavering determination. "We'll remarry Isha, properly. This time, there will be no loopholes." The journey home was silent, the city a blurred tapestry of colors and sounds. Isha leaned against Arthur, finding solace in the warmth of his presence. The unspoken understanding between them was a silent conversation, a shared burden carried with quiet resilience. Reaching their home, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had become a battleground, felt like stepping back onto familiar, yet fractured, ground. The air inside was thick with unspoken tensions, the silence heavy with the unresolved issues that still lingered. The victory felt hollow. The real battle, it seemed, had just begun. Their love story, they both knew, was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning. The mahogany table in the Blackwood dining room felt colder than usual. Arthur, his face etched with weariness, poured Isha a glass of wine, the ruby liquid shimmering under the chandelier's glow. The silence, punctuated only by the ticking grandfather clock, was a tangible entity, heavy with unspoken emotions. "They're coming around," Arthur said softly, his gaze meeting hers. He spoke of his family, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and caution. "Beatrice, she's different, more quiet, regretful." Isha nodded, swirling the wine in her glass. The crimson liquid mirrored the turbulent emotions churning within her. Beatrice's remorse felt fragile, a hesitant first step on a long road to redemption. "It's a slow process," she replied, her voice low. "Forgiveness doesn't happen overnight." She looked around the room, at the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to judge them even now. "But it's happening, Arthur. I can feel it." A hesitant knock echoed through the hall, followed by the hesitant entrance of Beatrice. Her eyes, usually flashing with defiance, were downcast, her posture humble. She carried a small, ornately carved wooden box. "Isha," Beatrice began, her voice barely a whisper. This belonged to your mother. I found it while clearing out the attic. I should have given it to you a long time ago." The box, inlaid with mother of pearl, felt strangely warm in Isha's hands. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, faded photograph. It showed a young woman, strikingly similar to Isha, laughing, her arm around a man whose face was partially obscured. A pang of longing, a painful yearning for a past she never knew, pierced through her. Tears welled in Isha's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The simple act of offering the box, of acknowledging past wrongs, was a powerful gesture, a testament to Beatrice's evolving understanding. Arthur placed a comforting hand on Isha's shoulder, his eyes filled with a profound love that transcended the turmoil of recent events. The room, once a symbol of familial discord, began to feel lighter, the air less thick with resentment. The path ahead remained uncertain, but in that shared moment of forgiveness and acceptance, a glimmer of hope shone through the lingering shadows. The journey toward healing had begun. The courtroom's hushed silence felt oppressive. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the gravity of the proceedings. Arthur, his usual crisp suit rumpled, sat beside Isha, her hand clasped tightly in his. Her knuckles were white, a testament to her inner turmoil. The judge's gavel, a small but potent symbol of authority, fell, echoing the finality of their victory. Their marriage, declared invalid due to consanguinity, was now legally sound, a new application reflecting their corrected family tree. A wave of relief washed over Arthur, so profound it almost buckled his knees. Isha, however, remained still, her eyes unfocused, reflecting the storm raging within. The legal battle was won, but the emotional wounds remained raw. The relief was laced with the bitter taste of betrayal, the lingering shadow of a family who had tried to tear them apart. Arthur saw the flicker of unshed tears in her eyes, the tremor in her usually steady hand. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of their apartment, overlooking the city's twinkling lights, Arthur held her close. "It's over, Isha," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The scent of her perfume, a delicate blend of jasmine and sandalwood, filled his senses, a familiar comfort in the aftermath of the storm. "Is it, though?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. The weight of years of uncertainty, the pain of a fractured past, hung heavy in the air. The city lights blurred through her tears. "We'll rebuild," Arthur vowed, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll build something stronger, something real, something ours." He traced the delicate curve of her jawline, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. The touch was a silent promise, a testament to the depth of his love. He knew rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The scars remained, visible and invisible, but he would face them with her side by side. He saw not just the pain, but also the quiet strength in her eyes, the unwavering determination that had carried them through the ordeal. It was a strength he admired and cherished, a strength that mirrored his own. Their love story, forged in the crucible of adversity, was far from over. It was just beginning. The scent of wood smoke and old parchment hung heavy in Arthur's study, a stark contrast to the sterile scent of the courtroom. He watched Isha, her back to him, gazing out the rain-streaked window. The city lights, a blurry kaleidoscope of color, seemed to mirror the turmoil in her eyes. Silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. "It's not just the legal victory, is it?" Arthur said softly, his voice a gentle hand reaching out to her. Isha turned, her face pale, etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "It's everything," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The lies, the deception, the fact that my own family, The people I should have been able to rely on tried to destroy my marriage, tried to destroy me. He walked towards her, the worn Persian rug muffling his footsteps. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the stray tears that escaped her gaze. They didn't know Isha, not then. They were blinded by their own prejudices, their own fears. She leaned into his touch, her body shaking slightly. But they did know. They knew about the fire, about the adoption, about me. The accusation, though unspoken, hung between them, sharp and painful. "I know," he admitted, his voice thick with guilt. "And I'm sorry for my family's actions, for my own silence. I failed you, Isha. I failed you and I failed myself." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, reflecting the city lights like a miniature, fractured star. "It's not just about them anymore," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about us, about what we do now." Arthur held her gaze, seeing the strength and resilience that had always been there, now burnished by fire. "We rebuild," he whispered, his voice a vow. "We build a life where the truth is known, where love prevails over prejudice, where our family, or what's left of it, can find redemption." He kissed her forehead, a tender gesture filled with a lifetime of unspoken promises. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime of the past, leaving behind the